Chapter 19 of The Benson Murder Case by S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vance cross-examines. Wednesday, June 19, 3:30 p.m. Captain Leacock walked into the room with a hopeless indifference of bearing. His shoulders drooped, his arms hung listlessly, his eyes were haggard, like those of a man who had not slept for days. On seeing Major Benson, he straightened a little, stepping toward him, extended his hand. It was plain that, however much he may have disliked Alvin Benson, he regarded the Major as a friend. But suddenly, realizing the situation, he turned away, embarrassed. The Major went quickly to him and touched him on the arm. "It's all right, Leacock," he said softly. "I can't think that you really shot Alvin." The captain turned apprehensive eyes upon him. "Of course I shot him." His voice was flat. "I told him I was going to." Vance came forward and indicated a chair. "Sit down, Captain. The district attorney wants to hear your story of the shooting. The law, you understand, does not accept murder confessions without corroboratory evidence. And since, in the present case, there are suspicions against others than yourself, we want you to answer some questions in order to substantiate your guilt. Otherwise, it will be necessary for us to follow up our suspicions." Taking a seat facing Leacock, he picked up the confession. "You say here you were satisfied that Mr. Benson had wronged you, and you went to his house at about 12:30 on the night of the 13th. When you speak of his wronging you, do you refer to his attentions to Miss St. Clair?" Leacock's face betrayed a sulky belligerence. "It doesn't matter why I shot him. Can't you leave Miss St. Clair out of it?" "Certainly," agreed Vance. "I promise you she shall not be brought into it. But we must understand your motive thoroughly." After a brief silence, Leacock said, "Very well, then. That was what I referred to." "How did you know Miss St. Clair went to dinner with Mr. Benson that night?" "I followed them to the Marseille." "And then you went home?" "Yes." "What made you go to Mr. Benson's house later?" "I got to thinking about it more and more, until I couldn't stand it any longer. I began to see red, and at last I took my Colt and went out, determined to kill him." A note of passion had crept into his voice. It seemed unbelievable that he could be lying. Vance again referred to the confession. "You dictated, 'I went to 87 West 48th Street, and entered the house by the front door.' Did you ring the bell, or was the front door unlatched?" Leacock was about to answer, but hesitated. Evidently he recalled the newspaper accounts of the housekeeper's testimony, in which she asserted positively that the bell had not rung that night. "What difference does it make?" He was sparring for time. "We'd like to know, that's all," Vance told him. "But no hurry." "Well, if it's so important to you, I didn't ring the bell, and the door wasn't unlocked." His hesitancy was gone. "Just as I reached the house, Benson drove up in a taxicab." "Just a moment. Did you happen to notice another car standing in front of the house? A grey Cadillac?" "Why, yes." "Did you recognize its occupant?" There was another short silence. "I'm not sure. I think it was a man named Fife." "He and Mr. Benson were outside at the same time, then?" Leacock frowned. "No, not at the same time. There was nobody there when I arrived. I didn't see Fife until I came out a few minutes later." "He arrived in his car when you were inside, is that it?" "He must have." "I see. And now, to go back a little, Benson drove up in a taxicab. Then what?" "I went up to him and said I wanted to speak to him. He told me to come inside, and we went in together. He used his latchkey." "And now, Captain, tell us just what happened after you and Mr. Benson entered the house." "He laid his hat and stick on the hat rack, and we walked into the living room. He sat down by the table, and I stood up and said what I had to say. Then I drew my gun and shot him." Vance was closely watching the man, and Markham was leaning forward tensely. "How did it happen that he was reading at the time?" "I believe he did pick up a book while I was talking. Trying to appear indifferent, I reckon. Think now. You and Mr. Benson went into the living room directly from the hall as soon as you entered the house?" "Yes." "Then how do you account for the fact, Captain, that when Mr. Benson was shot, he had on his smoking jacket and slippers?" Leacock glanced nervously about the room. Before he answered, he wet his lips with his tongue. "Now that I think of it, Benson did go upstairs for a few minutes first. I guess I was too excited," he added desperately, "to recollect everything." "That's natural," Vance said sympathetically. "But when he came downstairs, did you happen to notice anything peculiar about his hair?" Leacock looked up vaguely. "His hair? I don't understand." "The colour of it, I mean. When Mr. Benson sat before you, under the table lamp, didn't you remark some difference, let us say, in the way his hair looked?" The man closed his eyes, as if striving to visualize the scene. "No, I don't remember." "A minor point," said Vance indifferently. "Did Benson's speech strike you as peculiar when he came downstairs? That is, was there a thickness or slight impediment of any kind in his voice?" Leacock was manifestly puzzled. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "He seemed to talk the way he always talked." "And did you happen to see a blue jewel case on the table?" "I didn't notice." Vance smoked a moment thoughtfully. "When you left the room, after shooting Mr. Benson, you turned out the lights, of course?" When no immediate answer came, Vance volunteered the suggestion. "You must have done so, for Mr. Fife says the house was dark when he drove up." Leacock then nodded an affirmative. "That's right. I couldn't recollect for the moment." "Now that you remember the fact, just how did you turn them off?" "I—" he began, and stopped. Then, finally, "at the switch." "And where is that switch located, Captain?" "I can't just recall." "Think a moment. Surely you can remember." "By the door leading into the hall, I think." "Which side of the door?" "How can I tell?" the man asked piteously. "I was too nervous. But I think it was on the right-hand side of the door." "The right-hand side when entering or leaving the room?" "As you go out." "That would be where the bookcase stands?" "Yes." Vance appeared satisfied. "Now there's the question of the gun," he said. "Why did you take it to Miss St. Clair?" "I was a coward," the man replied. "I was afraid they might find it at my apartment, and I never imagined she would be suspected." "And when she was suspected, you at once took the gun away and threw it into the East River?" "Yes." I suppose there was one cartridge missing from the magazine, too, which in itself would have been a suspicious circumstance. I thought of that. That's why I threw the gun away. Vance frowned. That's strange. There must have been two guns. We dredged the river, you know, and found a Colt automatic, but the magazine was full. Are you sure, Captain, that it was your gun you took from Miss St. Clair's and threw over the bridge? I knew no gun had been retrieved from the river, and I wondered what he was driving at. Was he, after all, trying to involve the girl? Markham, too, I could see, was in doubt. Leacock made no answer for several moments. When he spoke, it was with dogged sullenness. There weren't two guns. The one you found was mine. I refilled the magazine myself. Ah, that accounts for it. Vance's tone was pleasant and reassuring. Just one more question, Captain. Why did you come here today and confess? Leacock thrust his chin out, and for the first time during the cross-examination his eyes became animated. Why? It was the only honourable thing to do. You had unjustly suspected an innocent person, and I didn't want anyone else to suffer. This ended the interview. Markham had no questions to ask, and the deputy sheriff led the captain out. When the door had closed on him, a curious silence fell over the room. Markham sat smoking furiously, his hands folded behind his head, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The Major had settled back in his chair and was gazing at Vance with admiring satisfaction. Vance was watching Markham out of the corner of his eye, a drowsy smile on his lips. The expressions and attitudes of the three men conveyed perfectly their varying individual reactions to the interview. Markham troubled, the Major pleased, Vance cynical. It was Vance who broke the silence. He spoke easily, almost lazily. You see how silly the confession is, what? Our pure and lofty captain is an incredibly poor Munchausen. No one could lie as badly as he did who hadn't been born into the world that way. It's simply impossible to imagine such stupidity. And he did so want us to think him guilty. Very affectin'. He probably imagined you'd merely stick the confession in his shirt front and send him to the hangman. You noticed he hadn't even decided how he got into Benson's house that night. Fyfe's admitted presence outside almost spoiled his impromptu explanation of having entered bras dessus with his intended victim, and he didn't recall Benson's semi-negligee attire. When I reminded him of it, he had to contradict himself and send Benson trotting upstairs to make a rapid change. Luckily, the toupee wasn't mentioned in the newspapers. The captain couldn't imagine what I meant when I intimated that Benson had dyed his hair when changing his coat and shoes. By the by, Major, did your brother speak thickly when his false teeth were out? Noticeably so, answered the Major. If Alvin's plate had been removed that night, as I gather it had been from your question, Leacock would surely have noticed it. There were other things he didn't notice, said Vance. The jewel case, for instance, and the location of the electric light switch. He went badly astray on that point, added the Major. Alvin's house is old-fashioned, and the only switch in the room is a pendant one attached to the chandelier. Exactly, said Vance. However, his worst break was in connection with the gun. He gave his hand away completely there. He said he threw the pistol into the river, largely because of the missing cartridge, and when I told him the magazine was full, he explained that he had refilled it, So I wouldn't think it was anyone else's gun that was found. It's plain to see what's the matter. He thinks Miss Clare's guilty, and is determined to take the blame." "That's my impression," said Major Benson. "And yet," mused Vance, "the captain's attitude bothers me a little. There's no doubt he had something to do with the crime, else why should he have concealed his pistol the next day in Miss St. Clare's apartment? He's just the kind of silly beggar, d'ye see, who would threaten any man he thought had designs on his fiancée, and then carry out the threat if anything happened. And he has a guilty conscience, that's obvious. But for what? Certainly not the shooting. The crime was planned, and the captain never plans. He's the kind that gets an idée fixe, girds up his loins, and does the deed in knightly fashion, prepared to take the consequences. That sort of chivalry, you know, is sheer beau geste. Its acolytes want every one to know of their valour. And when they go forth to rid the world of a Don Juan, they're always clear-minded. The captain, for instance, wouldn't have overlooked his Lady Fair's gloves and handbag. He would have taken 'em away. In fact, it's just as certain he would have shot Benson. As it is, he didn't shoot him. That's the beetle in the amber. It's psychologically possible he would have done it, and psychologically impossible he would have done it in the way it was done." He lit a cigarette and watched the drifting spirals of smoke. "If it wasn't so fantastic, I'd say he started out to do it, and found it already done. And yet that's about the size of it. It would account for Fyfe's seeing him there, and for his secreting the gun at Miss St. Clare's the next day." The telephone rang. Colonel Ostrander wanted to speak to the district attorney. Markham, after a short conversation, turned a disgruntled look upon Vance. "Your bloodthirsty friend wanted to know if I'd arrested anyone yet. He offered to confer more of his invaluable suggestions upon me, in case I was still undecided as to who was guilty." "I heard you thanking him fulsomely for something or other. What did you give him to understand about your mental state?" "That I was still in the dark." Markham's answer was accompanied by a sombre, tired smile. It was his way of telling Vance that he had entirely rejected the idea of Captain Leacock's guilt. The Major went to him and held out his hand. "I know how you feel," he said. "This sort of thing is discouraging. But it's better that the guilty person should escape altogether than that an innocent man should be made to suffer. Don't work too hard, and don't let these disappointments get to you. You'll soon hit on the right solution. And when you do—" His jaw snapped shut, and he uttered the rest of the sentence between clenched teeth. "You'll meet with no opposition from me. I'll help you put the thing over." He gave Markham a grim smile, and took up his hat. "I'm going back to the office now. If you want me at any time, let me know. I may be able to help you later on." With a friendly, appreciative bow to Vance, he went out. Markham sat in silence for several minutes. "Damn it, Vance," he said irritably, "this case gets more difficult by the hour. I feel worn out." "You really shouldn't take it so seriously, old dear," Vance advised lightly. "It doesn't pay, you know, to worry over the trivia of existence. Nothing's new, and nothing's true, and nothing really matters. Several million Johnnies were killed in the war, and you don't let the fact bedevil your phagocytes or inflame your brain cells. But when one rotter is mercifully shot in your district, you lie awake nights perspiring over it, what? My word, you're deucedly inconsistent." "Consistency," began Markham, but Vance interrupted him. "Now, don't quote Emerson. I infinitely prefer Erasmus. You know, you ought to read his praise of folly. It would cheer you no end. That goaty old Dutch professor would never have grieved inconsolably over the destruction of Alvin le Chauve." "I'm not a fruges consumere natus like you," snapped Markham. "I was elected to this office." "Oh, quite. Loved I not honour more, and all that," Vance chimed in. "But don't be so sensitive. Even if the captain has succeeded in bungling his way out of jail, you have at least 5 possibles left. There's Mrs. Platts, and Mr. Fife, and Colonel Ostrander, and Miss Hoffman, and Mrs. Banning. I say, why don't you arrest 'em all, one at a time, and get 'em to confess? Heath would go crazy with joy." Markham was too crestfallen to resent this chaffing. Indeed, Vance's light-heartedness seemed to buoy him up. "If you want the truth," he said, "that's exactly what I feel I'm doing. I am restrained merely by my indecision as to which one to arrest first." "Stout fella!" Then Vance asked, "What are you going to do with the captain, now? It'll break his heart if you release him." "His heart'll have to break, I'm afraid." Markham reached for the telephone. "I'd better see to the formalities now." "Just a moment." Vance put forth a restraining hand. "Don't end his rapturous martyrdom just yet. Let him be happy for another day, at least. I've a notion he may be most useful to us, pining away in his lonely cell like the prisoner of Chillon." Markham put down the telephone without a word. More and more, I had noticed, he was becoming inclined to accept Vance's leadership. This attitude was not merely the result of the hopeless confusion in his mind, though his uncertainty probably influenced him to some extent, but it was due in large measure to the impression Vance had given him of knowing more than he cared to reveal. "Have you tried to figure out just how Fife and his turtle-dove fit into the case?" Vance asked. "Along with a few thousand other enigmas, yes," was the petulant reply. "But the more I try to reason it out, the more of a mystery the whole thing becomes." "Loosely put, my dear Markham," criticized Vance. "There are no mysteries originating in human beings, you know. There are only problems. And any problem originating in one human being can be solved by another human being. It merely requires a knowledge of the human mind and the application of that knowledge to human acts. Simple, what?" He glanced at the clock. "I wonder how your Mr. Sitt is getting along with the Benson and Benson books. I await his report with anticipatory excitement." This was too much for Markham. The wearing-down process of Vance's intimations and veiled innuendos had at last dissipated his self-control. He bent forward and struck the desk angrily with his hand. "I'm damned tired of this superior attitude of yours," he complained hotly. "Either you know something or you don't. If you don't know anything, do me the favour of dropping these insinuations of knowledge. If you do know anything, it's up to you to tell me. You've been hinting around in one way or another ever since Benson was shot. If you've got any idea who killed him, I want to know it." He leaned back and took out a cigar. Not once did he look up as he carefully clipped the end and lit it. I think he was a little ashamed at having given way to his anger. Vance had sat, apparently unconcerned, during the outburst. At length he stretched his legs and gave Markham a long contemplative look. "You know, Markham, old bean, I don't blame you a bit for your unseemly ebullition. The situation has been most provokin'. But now I fancy the time has come to put an end to this commedietta. I really haven't been spoofing, you know. The fact is, I've some most interestin' ideas on the subject." He stood up and yawned. "It's a beastly hot day, but it must be done, eh, what? So nigh is grandeur to our dust, so near is God to man. When duty whispers low, 'Thou must,' the youth replies, 'I can.' I'm the noble youth, don't you know? And you're the voice of duty, though you didn't exactly whisper, did you? 'Was aber ist deine Pflicht?' And Goethe answered, 'Die Förderung des Tages.' But, deuce take it, I wish the demand had come on a cooler day." He handed Markham his hat. "Come, Postume, to everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." Footnote 17. This quotation from Ecclesiastes reminds me that Vance regularly read the Old Testament. "When I weary of the professional literary man," he once said, "I find stimulation in the majestic prose of the Bible. If the moderns feel that they simply must write, they should be made to spend at least 2 hours a day with the biblical historians." "You are through with the office for to-day? Inform Swacker of the fact, will you? There's a dear. We attend upon a lady. Miss St. Clair, no less." Markham realised that Vance's jesting manner was only the masquerade of a very serious purpose. Also, he knew that Vance would tell him what he knew or suspected only in his own way, and that no matter how circuitous and unreasonable that way might appear, Vance had excellent reasons for following it. Furthermore, since the unmasking of Captain Leacock's purely fictitious confession, he was in a state of mind to follow any suggestion that held the faintest hope of getting at the truth. He therefore rang at once for Swacker, and informed him he was quitting the office for the day. In 10 minutes we were in the subway, on our way to 94 Riverside Drive. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lady Explains. Wednesday, June 19, 4:30 p.m. "The quest for enlightenment upon which we are now embarked," said Vance, as we rode uptown, "may prove a bit tedious, but you must exert your will-power and bear with me. You can't imagine what a ticklish task I have on my hands, and it's not a pleasant one either. I'm a bit too young to be sentimental, and yet, d'you know, I'm half inclined to let your culprit go." "Would you mind telling me why we are calling on Miss St. Clair?" asked Markham resignedly. Vance amiably complied. "Not at all. Indeed, I deem it best for you to know. There are several points connected with the lady that need elucidation. First, there are the gloves and the handbag. Nor poppy nor mandragora shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep which thou owedst yesterday until you have learned about those articles. Eh, what? Then, you recall, Miss Hoffman told us that the Major was lending an ear when a certain lady called on Benson the day he was shot. I suspect that the visitor was Miss St. Clair, and I am rather curious to know what took place in the office that day, and why she came back later. Also, why did she go to Benson's for tea that afternoon? And what part did the jewels play in the chit-chat? But there are other items. For example, why did the captain take his gun to her? What makes him think she shot Benson? He really believes it, you know. And why did she think that he was guilty from the first? Markham looked sceptical. You expect her to tell all this? My hopes run high, returned Vance. With her night jailed as a self-confessed murderer, she will have nothing to lose by unburdening her soul. But we must have no blustering. Your police brand of aggressive cross-examination will, I assure you, have no effect upon this lady. Just how do you propose to elicit your information? With morbidezza, as the painters say. Much more refined and gentlemanly, you know. Markham considered a moment. I think I'll keep out of it and leave the Socratic elenchus entirely to you. Extraordinarily brilliant suggestion, said Vance. When we arrived, Markham announced over the house telephone that he had come on a vitally important mission, and we were received by Miss St. Clair without a moment's delay. She was apprehensive, I imagine, concerning the whereabouts of Captain Leacock. As she sat before us in her little drawing-room overlooking the Hudson, her face was quite pale, and her hands, though tightly clasped, trembled a little. She had lost much of her cold reserve, and there were unmistakable signs of sleeplessness and worry about her eyes. Vance went directly to the point. His tone was almost flippant in its lightness. It at once relieved the tension of the atmosphere and gave an air bordering on inconsequentiality to our visit. Captain Leacock has, I regret to inform you, very foolishly confessed to the murder of Mr. Benson. But we are not entirely satisfied with his bona fides. We are, alas, awash between Scylla and Charybdis. We cannot decide whether the captain is a deep-dyed villain or a chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. His story of how he accomplished the dark deed is a bit sketchy. He is vague on certain essential details, and what's most confusing, he turned the lights off in Benson's hideous living-room by a switch which positively doesn't exist. Consequently, the suspicion has crept into my mind that he has concocted this little tale of derring-do in order to shield someone whom he really believes guilty. He indicated Markham with a slight movement of the head. The district attorney here does not wholly agree with me, but then, d'ye see, the legal mind is incredibly rigid and unreceptive once it has been invaded by a notion. You will remember that because you were with Mr. Alvin Benson on his last evening on earth, and for other reasons equally irrelevant and trivial, Mr. Markham actually concluded that you had had something to do with the gentleman's death. He gave Markham a smile of waggish reproach, and went on. Since you, Miss St. Clair, are the only person whom Captain Leacock would shield so heroically, and since I, at least, am convinced of your own innocence. Will you not clear up for us a few of those points where your orbit crossed that of Mr. Benson? Such information cannot do the captain or yourself any harm, and it is very possible it will help to banish from Mr. Markham's mind his lingering doubts as to the captain's innocence." Vance's manner had an assuaging effect upon the woman, but I could see that Markham was boiling inwardly at Vance's animadversions on him, though he refrained from any interruption. Miss St. Clair stared steadily at Vance for several minutes. "I don't know why I should trust you, or even believe you," she said evenly. "But now that Captain Leacock has confessed, I was afraid he was going to, when he last spoke to me, I see no reason why I should not answer your questions. Do you truly think he is innocent?" The question was like an involuntary cry. Her pent-up emotion had broken through her carapace of calm. "I truly do," Vance avowed soberly. "Mr. Markham will tell you that before we left his office I pleaded with him to release Captain Leacock. It was with the hope that your explanations would convince him of the wisdom of such a course that I urged him to come here." Something in his tone and manner seemed to inspire her confidence. "What do you wish to ask me?" she asked. Vance cast another reproachful glance at Markham, who was restraining his outraged feelings only with difficulty, and then turned back to the woman. "First of all, will you explain how your gloves and hand-bag found their way into Mr. Benson's house? Their presence there has been preying most distressingly on the district attorney's mind." She turned a direct, frank gaze upon Markham. "I dined with Mr. Benson at his invitation. Things between us were not pleasant, and when we started for home my resentment of his attitude increased. At Times Square I ordered the chauffeur to stop. I preferred returning home alone. In my anger and my haste to get away, I must have dropped my gloves and bag. It was not until Mr. Benson had driven off that I realized my loss, and having no money, I walked home. Since my things were found in Mr. Benson's house, he must have taken them there himself." "Such was my own belief," said Vance. "And, my word, it's a deucedly long walk out here, what?" He turned to Markham with a tantalizing smile. "Really, you know, Miss St. Clair couldn't have been expected to reach here before 1." Markham, grim and resolute, made no reply. "And now," pursued Vance, "I should love to know under what circumstances the invitation to dinner was extended." A shadow darkened her face, but her voice remained even. "I had been losing a lot of money through Mr. Benson's firm, and suddenly my intuition told me that he was purposely seeing to it that I did lose, and that he could, if he desired, help me to recoup." She dropped her eyes. "He had been annoying me with his attentions for some time, and I didn't put any despicable scheme past him. I went to his office and told him quite plainly what I suspected. He replied that if I'd dine with him that night we could talk it over. I knew what his object was, but I was so desperate I decided to go anyway, hoping I might plead with him." "And how did you happen to mention to Mr. Benson the exact time your little dinner party would terminate?" She looked at Vance in astonishment, but answered unhesitatingly. "He said something about making a gay night of it, and then I told him very emphatically that if I went I would leave him sharply at midnight, as was my invariable rule on all parties. You see," she added, "I study very hard at my singing, and going home at midnight, no matter what the occasion, is one of the sacrifices, or rather restrictions, I impose on myself." "Most commendable and most wise," commented Vance. "Was this fact generally known among your acquaintances?" "Oh, yes. It even resulted in my being nicknamed Cinderella." "Specifically, did Colonel Ostrander and Mr. Fyfe know it?" "Yes." Vance thought a moment. "How did you happen to go to tea at Mr. Benson's home the day of the murder, if you were to dine with him that night?" A flush stained her cheeks. "There was nothing wrong in that," she declared. "Somehow, after I had left Mr. Benson's office, I revolted against my decision to dine with him, and I went to his house (I had gone back to the office first, but he had left) to make a final appeal, and to beg him to release me from my promise. But he laughed the matter off, and, after insisting that I have tea, sent me home in a taxicab to dress for dinner. He called for me about 7:30. "And when you pleaded with him to release you from your promise, you sought to frighten him by recalling Captain Leacock's threat, and he said it was only a bluff?" Again the woman's astonishment was manifest. "Yes," she murmured. Vance gave her a soothing smile. "Colonel Ostrander told me he saw you and Mr. Benson at the Marseilles." "Yes, and I was terribly ashamed. He knew what Mr. Benson was, and had warned me against him only a few days before. I was under the impression the Colonel and Mr. Benson were good friends." "They were, up to a week ago. But the Colonel lost more money than I did in a stock pool which Mr. Benson engineered recently, and he intimated to me very strongly that Mr. Benson had deliberately misadvised us to his own benefit. He didn't even speak to Mr. Benson that night at the Marseilles." "What about these rich and precious stones that accompanied your tea with Mr. Benson?" "Bribes," she answered, and her contemptuous smile was a more eloquent condemnation of Benson than if she had resorted to the bitterest castigation. "The gentleman sought to turn my head with them. I was offered a string of pearls to wear to dinner, but I declined them. And I was told that if I saw things in the right light, or some such charming phrase, I could have jewels just like them for my very, very own, perhaps even those identical ones, on the 21st. "Of course, the 21st, grinned Vance. "Markham, are you listening? On the 21st, Leander's note falls due, and if it's not paid the jewels are forfeited." He addressed himself again to Miss St. Clair. "Did Mr. Benson have the jewels with him at dinner?" "Oh, no. I think my refusal of the pearls rather discouraged him." Vance paused, looking at her with ingratiating cordiality. "Tell us now, please, of the gun episode. In your own words, as the lawyers say, hoping to entangle you later." But she evidently feared no entanglement. "The morning after the murder, Captain Leacock came here and said he had gone to Mr. Benson's house about 12:30 with the intention of shooting him. But he had seen Mr. Fyfe outside, and, assuming he was calling, had given up the idea and gone home. I feared that Mr. Fyfe had seen him, and I told him it would be safer to bring his pistol to me, and to say, if questioned, that he'd lost it in France. You see, I really thought he had shot Mr. Benson, and was, well, lying like a gentleman to spare my feelings. Then, when he took the pistol from me with the purpose of throwing it away altogether, I was even more certain of it." She smiled faintly at Markham. "That was why I refused to answer your questions. I wanted you to think that maybe I had done it, so you'd not suspect Captain Leacock." "But he wasn't lying at all," said Vance. "I know now that he wasn't, and I should have known it before. He'd never have brought the pistol to me if he'd been guilty." A film came over her eyes. "And, poor boy, he confessed because he thought that I was guilty." "That's precisely the Harrowin situation," nodded Vance. "But where did he think you had obtained a weapon?" "I know many army men, friends of his and of Major Benson's, and last summer at the mountains I did considerable pistol practice for the fun of it. Oh, the idea was reasonable enough." Vance rose and made a courtly bow. "You've been most gracious and most helpful," he said. "You see, Mr. Markham had various theories about the murder. The first, I believe, was that you alone were the Madame Borgia. The second was that you and the captain did the deed together, à quatre mains, as it were. The third was that the captain pulled the trigger a cappella, and the legal mind is so exquisitely developed that it can believe in several conflicting theories at the same time. The sad thing about the present case is that Mr. Markham still leans toward the belief that both of you are guilty individually and collectively. I tried to reason with him before coming here, but I failed. Therefore I insisted upon his hearing from your own charming lips your story of the affair." He went up to Markham, who sat glaring at him with lips compressed. "Well, old chap," he remarked pleasantly, "surely you are not going to persist in your obsession that either Miss St. Clair or Captain Leacock is guilty, what? And won't you relent and unshackle the captain, as I begged you to?" He extended his arms in a theatrical gesture of supplication. Markham's wrath was at the breaking point, but he got up deliberately, and, going to the woman, held out his hand. "Miss St. Clair," he said kindly, and again I was impressed by the bigness of the man, "I wish to assure you that I have dismissed the idea of your guilt, and also Captain Leacock's, from what Mr. Vance terms my incredibly rigid and unreceptive mind. I forgive him, however, because he has saved me from doing you a very grave injustice, and I will see that you have your captain back as soon as the papers can be signed for his release." As we walked out onto Riverside Drive, Markham turned savagely on Vance. "So I was keeping her precious captain locked up, and you were pleading with me to let him go. You know damned well I didn't think either one of them was guilty, you lounge lizard." Vance sighed. "Dear me, don't you want to be of any help at all in this case?" he added sadly. "What good did it do you to make an ass of me in front of that woman?" spluttered Markham. "I can't see that you got anywhere with all your tomfoolery." "What?" Vance registered utter amazement. "The testimony you've heard to-day is going to help immeasurably in convicting the culprit. Furthermore, we now know about the gloves and handbag, and who the lady was that called at Benson's office, and what Miss St. Clair did between 12 and 1, and why she dined alone with Alvin, and why she first had tea with him, and how the jewels came to be there, and why the captain took her his gun and then threw it away, and why he confessed. My word, doesn't all this knowledge soothe you? It rids the situation of so much debris." He stopped and lit a cigarette. "The really important thing the lady told us was that her friends knew she invariably departed at midnight when she went out of an evening. Don't overlook or belittle that point, old dear. It's most pertinent. I told you long ago that the person who shot Benson knew she was dining with him that night." "You'll be telling me next you know who killed him," Markham scoffed. Vance sent a ring of smoke circling upward. "I've known all along who shot the blighter." Markham snorted derisively. "Indeed. And when did this revelation burst upon you?" "Oh, not more than 5 minutes after I entered Benson's house that first morning," replied Vance. "Well, well. Why didn't you confide in me and avoid all these trying activities?" "Quite impossible," Vance explained jocularly. "You were not ready to receive my apocryphal knowledge. It was first necessary to lead you patiently by the hand out of the various dark forests and morasses into which you insisted upon straying. You're so devilishly unimaginative, don't you know?" A taxicab was passing, and he hailed it. "87 West 48th Street," he directed. Then he took Markham's arm confidingly. "Now for a brief chat with Mrs. Platts, and then I shall pour into your ear all my maidenly secrets." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sartorial Revelations. Wednesday, June 19, 5:30 p.m. The housekeeper regarded our visit that afternoon with marked uneasiness. Though she was a large, powerful woman, her body seemed to have lost some of its strength, and her face showed signs of prolonged anxiety. Snitkin informed us, when we entered, that she had carefully read every newspaper account of the progress of the case, and had questioned him interminably on the subject. She entered the living-room with scarcely an acknowledgment of our presence, and took the chair Vance placed for her like a woman resigning herself to a dreaded but inevitable ordeal. When Vance looked at her keenly, she gave him a frightened glance and turned her face away, as if, in the second their eyes met, she had read his knowledge of some secret she had been jealously guarding. Vance began his questioning without prelude or protasis. "Mrs. Platts, was Mr. Benson very particular about his toupee? That is, did he often receive his friends without having it on?" The woman appeared relieved. "Oh, no, sir, never." "Think back, Mrs. Platts. Has Mr. Benson never, to your knowledge, been in anyone's company without his toupee?" She was silent for some time, her brows contracted. "Once I saw him take off his wig and show it to Colonel Ostrander, an elderly gentleman who used to call here very often. But Colonel Ostrander was an old friend of his. He told me they lived together once." "No one else?" Again she frowned thoughtfully. "No," she said after several minutes. What about the tradespeople? He was very particular about them, and strangers too, she added. When he used to sit in here in hot weather without his wig, he always pulled the shade on that window. She pointed to the one nearest the hallway. You can look in it from the steps. I'm glad you brought up that point, said Vance. And anyone standing on the steps could tap on the window or the iron bars and attract the attention of anyone in this room? Oh, yes, sir, easily. I did it myself once, when I went on an errand and forgot my key. It's quite likely, don't you think, that the person who shot Mr. Benson obtained admittance in that way? Yes, sir, she grasped eagerly at the suggestion. The person would have had to know Mr. Benson pretty well to tap on the window instead of ringing the bell. Don't you agree with me, Mrs. Platts? Yes, sir. Her tone was doubtful. Evidently the point was a little beyond her. If a stranger had tapped on the window, would Mr. Benson have admitted him without his toupee? Oh, no, he wouldn't have let a stranger in. You are sure the bell didn't ring that night? Positive, sir. The answer was very emphatic. Is there a light on the front steps? No, sir. If Mr. Benson had looked out of the window to see who was tapping, could he have recognized the person at night? The woman hesitated. I don't know. I don't think so. Is there any way you can see through the front door who is outside without opening it? No, sir. Sometimes I wish there was. Then, if the person knocked on the window, Mr. Benson must have recognized the voice. It looks that way, sir. And you're certain no one could have got in without a key? How could they? The door locks by itself. It's the regulation spring lock, isn't it? Yes, sir. Then it must have a catch you can turn off, so that the door will open from either side, even though it's latched. It did have a catch like that, she explained, but Mr. Benson had it fixed, so it wouldn't work. He said it was too dangerous. I might go out and leave the house unlocked. Vance stepped into the hallway, and I heard him opening and shutting the front door. You're right, Mrs. Platts, he observed when he came back. Now tell me, are you quite sure no one had a key? Yes, sir. No one but me and Mr. Benson had a key. Vance nodded his acceptance of her statement. You said you left your bedroom door open on the night Mr. Benson was shot. Do you generally leave it open? No, I most always shut it, but it was terrible close that night. Then it was merely an accident you left it open, as you might say. If your door had been closed, as usual, could you have heard the shot, do you think? If I'd been awake, maybe. Not if I was sleeping, though. They got heavy doors in these old houses, sir. And they're beautiful, too, commented Vance. He looked admiringly at the massive mahogany double door that opened into the hall. You know, Markham, our so-called civilization is nothing more than the persistent destruction of everything that's beautiful and enduring, and the designing of cheap makeshifts. You should read Oswald Spengler's Untergang des Abendlands, a most penetrating document. I wonder some enterprising publisher hasn't embalmed it in our native argot. Footnote 18. The book, or a part of it, has, I believe, been recently translated into English. The whole history of this degenerate era we call modern civilization can be seen in our woodwork. Look at that fine old door, for instance, with its bevelled panels and ornamented bolection, and its Ionic pilasters and carved lintel, and then compare it with the flat, flimsy, machine-made, shellacked boards which are turned out by the thousand to-day. Sic transit. He studied the door for some time, then turned abruptly back to Mrs. Platts, who was eyeing him curiously and with mounting apprehension. "What did Mr. Benson do with the box of jewels when he went out to dinner?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," she answered nervously. "He left them on the table there." "Did you see them after he had gone out?" "Yes, and I was going to put them away, but I decided I'd better not touch them." "And nobody came to the door or entered the house after Mr. Benson left?" "No, sir." "You're quite sure?" "I'm positive, sir." Vance rose and began to pace the floor. Suddenly, just as he was passing the woman, he stopped and faced her. "Was your maiden name Hoffmann, Mrs. Platts?" The thing she had been dreading had come. Her face paled, her eyes opened wide, and her lower lip drooped a little. Vance stood looking at her, not unkindly. Before she could regain control of herself, he said, "I had the pleasure of meeting your charming daughter recently." "My daughter?" the woman managed to stammer. "Miss Hoffman, you know, the attractive young lady with the blonde hair, Mr. Benson's secretary." The woman sat erect and spoke through clamped teeth. "She's not my daughter." Now, Mrs. Platts," Vance chided her, as if speaking to a child. "Why this foolish attempt at deception? You remember how worried you were when I accused you of having a personal interest in the lady who was here to tea with Mr. Benson? You were afraid I thought it was Miss Hoffman. But why should you be anxious about her, Mrs. Platts? I'm sure she's a very nice girl, and you really can't blame her for preferring the name of Hoffman to that of Platts. Platts means generally a place, though it also means a crash or an explosion, and sometimes a Platts is a bun or a yeast cake. But a Hoffmann is a courtier, much nicer than being a yeast cake, what?" He smiled engagingly, and his manner had a quieting effect upon her. "It isn't that, sir," she said, looking at him appealingly. "I made her take the name. In this country, any girl who's smart can get to be a lady if she's given a chance, and—" "I understand perfectly," Vance interposed pleasantly. "Miss Hoffman is clever, and you feared that the fact of your being a housekeeper, if it became known, would stand in the way of her success. So you're eliminating yourself, as it were, for her welfare. I think it was very generous of you. Your daughter lives alone?" "Yes, sir, in Morningside Heights, but I see her every week." Her voice was barely audible. "Of course, as often as you can, I'm sure. Did you take the position as Mr. Benson's housekeeper because she was his secretary?" She looked up, a bitter expression in her eyes. "Yes, sir, I did. She told me the kind of man he was, and he often made her come to the house here in the evenings to do extra work." "And you wanted to be here to protect her?" "Yes, sir, that was it." "Why were you so worried the morning after the murder, when Mr. Markham here asked you if Mr. Benson kept any firearms around the house?" The woman shifted her gaze. I wasn't worried. Yes, you were, Mrs. Platts, and I'll tell you why. You were afraid we might think Miss Hoffman shot him. Oh, no, sir, I wasn't, she cried. My girl wasn't even here that night, I swear it. She wasn't here. She was badly shaken. The nervous tension of a week had snapped, and she looked helplessly about her. Come, come, Mrs. Platts, pleaded Vance consolingly. No one believes for a moment that Miss Hoffman had a hand in Mr. Benson's death. The woman peered searchingly into his face. At first, she was loath to believe him. It was evident that fear had long been preying on her mind, and it took him fully a quarter of an hour to convince her that what he had said was true. When finally we left the house, she was in a comparatively peaceful state of mind. On our way to the Stuyvesant Club, Markham was silent, completely engrossed with his thoughts. It was evident that the new facts educed by the interview with Mrs. Platts troubled him considerably. Vance sat smoking dreamily, turning his head now and then to inspect the buildings we passed. We drove east through 48th Street, and when we came abreast of the New York Bible Society house, he ordered the chauffeur to stop and insisted that we admire it. Christianity, he remarked, has almost vindicated itself by its architecture alone. With few exceptions, the only buildings in this city that are not eyesores are the churches and their allied structures. The American aesthetic credo is whatever's big is beautiful. These depressing gargantuan boxes with rectangular holes in 'em, which are called skyscrapers, are worshipped by Americans simply because they're huge. A box with 40 rows of holes is twice as beautiful as a box with 20 rows. Simple formula, what? Look at this little 5-story affair across the street. It's infinitely lovelier, and more impressive, too, than any skyscraper in the city. Vance referred but once to the crime during our ride to the club, and then only indirectly. Kind hearts, you know, Markham, are more than coronets. I've done a good deed to-day, and I feel positively virtuous. Frau Platts will schlafen much better to-night. She has been frightfully upset about little Gretchen. She's a doughty old soul, motherly and all that, and she couldn't bear to think of the future Lady Vere de Vere being suspected. Wonder why she worried so. And he gave Markham a sly look. Nothing further was said until after dinner, which we ate in the roof garden. We had pushed back our chairs and sat looking out over the tree-tops of Madison Square. Now, Markham, said Vance, give over all your prejudices and consider the situation judiciously, as you lawyers euphemistically put it. To begin with, we know now why Mrs. Platts was so worried at your question regarding firearms, and why she was upset by my reference to her personal interest in Benson's tea companion. So those two mysteries are eliminated. How did you find out about her relation to the girl? Interjected Markham. 'Twas my ogling, did it? Vance gave him a reproving look. You recall that I ogled the young lady at our first meeting? But I forgive you, and you remember our little discussion about cranial idiosyncrasies? Miss Hoffman, I noticed at once, possessed all the physical formations of Benson's housekeeper. She was brachycephalic, she had over-articulated cheekbones, an orthogonous jaw, a low, flat parietal structure, and a Mesopotamian nose. Then I looked for her ear, for I had noted that Mrs. Platt's had the pointed, lobeless satyr ear, sometimes called the Darwin ear. These ears run in families. When I saw that Miss Hoffman's were of the same type, even though modified, I was fairly certain of the relationship. But there were other similarities, in pigment, for instance, and in height. Both are tall, you know, and the central masses of each were very large in comparison with the peripheral masses. The shoulders were narrow, and the wrists and ankles small, while the hips were bulky. That Hoffman was Platz's maiden name was only a guess, but it didn't matter. Vance adjusted himself more comfortably in his chair. Now for your judicial considerations. First, let us assume that at a little before 12:30 on the night of the 13th, the villain came to Benson's house, saw the light in the living room, tapped on the window, and was instantly admitted. What, would you say, do these assumptions indicate regarding the visitor? Merely that Benson was acquainted with him, returned Markham. But that doesn't help us any. We can't extend the sus per col to everybody the man knew. The indications go much further than that, old chap, Vance retorted. They show unmistakably that Benson's murderer was a most intimate crony, or, at least, a person before whom he didn't care how he looked. The absence of the toupee, as I once suggested to you, was a prime essential of the situation. A toupee, don't you know, is the sartorial sine qua non of every middle-aged Beau Brummel afflicted with baldness. You heard Mrs. Platt's on the subject. Do you think for a second that Benson, who hid his hirsute deficiency even from the grocer's boy, would visit with a mere acquaintance thus bereft of his crowning glory? And besides being thus denuded, he was without his full complement of teeth. Moreover, he was without collar or tie, and attired in an old smoking jacket and bedroom slippers. Picture the spectacle, my dear fellow. A man does not look fascinating without his collar, and with his shirt-band and gold stud exposed. Thus attired, he is the equivalent of a lady in curl-papers. How many men do you think Benson knew with whom he would have sat down to a tete-a-tete in this undressed condition? 3 or 4, perhaps, answered Markham, but I can't arrest them all. I'm sure you would if you could, but it won't be necessary. Vance selected another cigarette from his case and went on. There are other helpful indications, you know. For instance, the murderer was fairly well acquainted with Benson's domestic arrangements. He must have known that the housekeeper slept a good distance from the living room, and would not be startled by the shot if her door was closed as usual. Also, he must have known there was no one else in the house at that hour. And another thing, don't forget that his voice was perfectly familiar to Benson. If there had been the slightest doubt about it, Benson would not have let him in view of his natural fear of housebreakers, and with the captain's threat hanging over him. That's a tenable hypothesis. What else? The jewels, Markham. Those orators of love. Have you thought of them? They were on the centre table when Benson came home that night, and they were gone in the morning. Wherefore, it seems inevitable that the murderer took 'em. What?
And may they not have been one reason for the murderer's coming there that night? If so, who of Benson's most intimate personae gratae knew of their presence in the house, and who wanted them particularly?
Exactly, Vance. Markham nodded his head slowly. You've hit it. I've had an uneasy feeling about Fife right along. I was on the point of ordering his arrest today, when Heath brought word of Leacock's confession. And then, when that blew up, my suspicions reverted to him. I said nothing this afternoon, because I wanted to see where your ideas had led you. What you've been saying checks up perfectly with my own notions. Fife's our man. He brought the front legs of his chair down suddenly. And now, damn it, you've let him get away from us.
Don't fret, old dear, said Vance. He's safe with Mrs. Fife, I fancy. And anyhow, your friend Mr. Ben Hanlon is well versed in retrieving fugitives. Let the harassed Leander alone for the moment. You don't need him tonight, and tomorrow you won't want him.
Markham wheeled about. What's that? I won't want him? And why, pray?
Well, Vance explained indolently, he hasn't a congenial and lovable nature, has he? And he's not exactly an object of blinding beauty. I shouldn't want him around me any more than was necessary, don't you know? Incidentally, he's not guilty.
Markham was too nonplussed to be exasperated. He regarded Vance searchingly for a full minute. I don't follow you, he said. If you think Fife's innocent, who, in God's name, do you think is guilty? Vance glanced at his watch.
Come to my house tomorrow for breakfast, and bring those alibis you asked Heath for, and I'll tell you who shot Benson.
Something in his tone impressed Markham. He realized that Vance would not have made so specific a promise unless he was confident of his ability to keep it. He knew Vance too well to ignore or even minimize his statement. Why not tell me now? He asked.
Awfully sorry, you know, apologized Vance. But I'm going to the Philharmonic's special tonight. They're playing César Franck's D minor, and Stransky's temperament is eminently suited to its diatonic sentimentalities. You'd better come along, old man. Soothin' to the nerves and all that.
Not me, grumbled Markham. What I need is a brandy and soda. He walked down with us to the taxicab.
Come at 9 tomorrow, said Vance as we took our seats. Let the office wait a bit, and don't forget to phone Heath for those alibis.
Then, just as we started off, he leaned out of the car.
And I say, Markham, how tall would you say Mrs. Platts is?
End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vance outlines a theory. Thursday, June 20, 9 a.m. Markham came to Vance's apartment at promptly 9 o'clock the next morning. He was in a bad humor. Now, see here, Vance, he said, as soon as he was seated at the table. I want to know what was the meaning of your parting words last night. Eat your melon, old dear, said Vance. It comes from northern Brazil, and is very delicious. But don't devitalize its flavor with pepper or salt. An amazin' practice, that. though not as amazin' as stuffing a melon with ice cream. The American does the most dumbfoundin' things with ice cream. He puts it on pie, he puts it in soda water, he encases it in hard chocolate like a bonbon, he puts it between sweet biscuits and calls the result an ice cream sandwich. He even uses it instead of whipped cream in a charlotte russe. "What I want to know," began Markham, but Vance did not permit him to finish. "It's surprisin', you know, the erroneous ideas people have about melons. There are only two species, the musk melon and the watermelon. All breakfast melons, like cantaloupes, citrons, nutmegs, casabas, honeydews, are varieties of the musk melon. But people have the notion, you see, that cantaloupe is a generic term. Philadelphians call all melons cantaloupes, whereas this type of musk melon was first cultivated in Cantalupo, Italy." "Very interesting," said Markham, with only partially disguised impatience. "Did you intend by your remark last night—" "And after the melon, Curry has prepared a special dish for you. It's my own gustatory chef d'oeuvre, with Curry's collaboration, of course. I've spent months on its conception, composing and organizing it, so to speak. I haven't named it yet. Perhaps you can suggest a fitting appellation. To achieve this dish, one first chops up a hard-boiled egg and mixes it with grated Port du Salut cheese, adding a soupçon of tarragon. This paste is then enclosed in a fillet of white perch, like a French pancake. It is tied with silk, rolled in a specially prepared almond batter, and cooked in sweet butter. That, of course, is the barest outline of its manufacture, with all the truly exquisite details omitted." "It sounds appetizing." Markham's tone was devoid of enthusiasm. "But I didn't come here for a cooking lesson." "You know, you underestimate the importance of your ventral pleasures," pursued Vance. "Eating is the one infallible guide to a people's intellectual advancement, as well as the inevitable gauge of the individual's temperament. The savage cooked and ate like a savage. In the early days of the human race, mankind was cursed with one vast epidemic of indigestion. There's where his devils and demons and ideas from hell came from. They were the nightmares of his dyspepsia. Then, as man began to master the technique of cooking, he became civilized, and when he achieved the highest pinnacles of the culinary art, he also achieved the highest pinnacles of cultural and intellectual glory. When the art of the gourmet retrogressed, so did man. The tasteless, standardized cookery of America is typical of our decadence. A perfectly blended soup, Markham, is more ennobling than Beethoven's C minor symphony." Markham listened stolidly to Vance's chatter during breakfast. He made several attempts to bring up the subject of the crime, but Vance glibly ignored each essay. It was not until Curry had cleared away the dishes that he referred to the object of Markham's visit. "Did you bring the Alibi reports?" was his first question. Markham nodded. "And it took me 2 hours to find Heath after you'd gone last night." "Sad," breathed Vance. He went to the desk and took a closely written double sheet of foolscap from one of the compartments. "I wish you'd glance this over and give me your learned opinion," he said, handing the paper to Markham. "I prepared it last night after the concert." I later took possession of the document and filed it with my other notes and papers pertaining to the Benson case. The following is a verbatim copy. Hypothesis. Mrs. Anna Platz shot and killed Alvin Benson on the night of June 13th. Place. She lived in the house, and admitted being there at the time the shot was fired. Opportunity. She was alone in the house with Benson. All the windows were either barred or locked on the inside. The front door was locked. There was no other means of ingress. Her presence in the living room was natural. She might have entered ostensibly to ask Benson a domestic question. Her standing directly in front of him would not necessarily have caused him to look up. Hence his reading attitude. Who else could have come so close to him for the purpose of shooting him without attracting his attention? He would not have cared how he appeared before his housekeeper. He had become accustomed to being seen by her without his teeth and toupee, and in negligee condition. Living in the house, she was able to choose a propitious moment for the crime. Time. She waited up for him. Despite her denial, he might have told her when he would return. When he came in alone and changed to his smoking jacket, she knew he was not expecting any late visitors. She chose a time shortly after his return, because it would appear that he had brought someone home with him, and that this other person had killed him. Means. She used Benson's own gun. Benson undoubtedly had more than one, for he would have been more likely to keep a gun in his bedroom than in his living room, and since a Smith & Wesson was found in the living room, there probably was another in the bedroom. Being his housekeeper, she knew of the gun upstairs. After he had gone down to the living room to read, she secured it and took it with her, concealed under her apron. She threw the gun away or hid it after the shooting. She had all night in which to dispose of it. She was frightened when asked what firearms Benson kept about the house, for she was not sure whether or not we knew of the gun in the bedroom. Motive. She took the position of housekeeper because she feared Benson's conduct toward her daughter. She always listened when her daughter came to his house at night to work. Recently, she discovered that Benson had dishonourable intentions, and believed her daughter to be in imminent danger. A mother who would sacrifice herself for her daughter's future, as she had done, would not hesitate at killing to save her. And there are the jewels. She has them hidden and is keeping them for her daughter. Would Benson have gone out and left them on the table? And if he had put them away, who but she, familiar with the house and having plenty of time, could have found them? Conduct. She lied about St. Clair's coming to tea, explaining later that she knew St. Clair could not have had anything to do with the crime. Was this feminine intuition? No. She could know St. Clair was innocent only because she herself was guilty. She was too motherly to want an innocent person suspected. She was markedly frightened yesterday when her daughter's name was mentioned, because she feared the discovery of the relationship might reveal her motive for shooting Benson. She admitted hearing the shot because, if she had denied it, a test might have proved that a shot in the living room would have sounded loudly in her room, and this would have aroused suspicion against her. Does a person, when awakened, turn on the lights and determine the exact hour? And if she had heard a report which sounded like a shot being fired in the house, would she not have investigated or given an alarm? When first interviewed, she showed plainly she disliked Benson. Her apprehension has been pronounced each time she's been questioned. She is the hard-headed, shrewd, determined German type, who could both plan and perform such a crime. Height. She is about 5 feet 10 inches tall, the demonstrated height of the murderer. Markham read this précis through several times. He was fully 15 minutes at the task, and when he had finished, he sat silent for 10 minutes more. Then he rose and walked up and down the room.
"Not a fancy legal document, that," remarked Vance. "But I think even a grand juror could understand it. You, of course, can rearrange and elaborate it, and bedeck it with innumerable meaningless phrases and recondite legal idioms." Markham did not answer at once. He paused by the French windows and looked down into the street. Then he said, "Yes, I think you've made out a case. Extraordinary. I've wondered from the first what you were getting at, and your questioning of Platt's yesterday impressed me as pointless. I'll admit it never occurred to me to suspect her. Benson must have given her good cause." He turned and came slowly towards us, his head down, his hands behind him. "I don't like the idea of arresting her. Funny, I never thought of her in connection with it." He stopped in front of Vance. "And you yourself didn't think of her at first, despite your boast that you knew who did it, after you'd been in Benson's house 5 minutes?" Vance smiled mirthfully and sprawled in his chair. Markham became indignant. "Damn it, you told me the next day that no woman could have done it, no matter what the evidence, and harangued me about art and psychology and God knows what." "Quite right," murmured Vance, still smiling. "No woman did it." "No woman did it?" Markham's gorge was rising rapidly. "Oh dear, no." He pointed to the sheet of paper in Markham's hand. "That's just a bit of spoofing, don't you know? Poor old Mrs. Platts. She's as innocent as a lamb." Markham threw the paper on the table and sat down. I had never seen him so furious, but he controlled himself admirably. "You see, my dear old bean," explained Vance, in his unemotional drawl, "I had an irresistible longing to demonstrate to you how utterly silly your circumstantial and material evidence is. I'm rather proud, you know, of my case against Mrs. Platts. I'm sure you could convict her on the strength of it. But, like the whole theory of your exalted law, it's wholly specious and erroneous. Circumstantial evidence, Markham, is the utterest tommyrot imaginable. Its theory is not unlike that of our present-day democracy. The democratic theory is that if you accumulate enough ignorance at the polls, you produce intelligence. And the theory of circumstantial evidence is that if you accumulate a sufficient number of weak links, you can produce a strong chain." "Did you get me here this morning," demanded Markham coldly, "to give me a dissertation on legal theory?" "Oh, no," Vance blithely assured him. "But I simply must prepare you for the acceptance of my revelation, for I haven't a scrap of material or circumstantial evidence against the guilty man. And yet, Markham, I know he's guilty, as well as I know you're sitting in that chair planning how you can torture and kill me without being punished. If you have no evidence, how did you arrive at your conclusion?" Markham's tone was vindictive. "Solely by psychological analysis, by what might be called the science of personal possibilities. A man's psychological nature is as clear a brand to one who can read it as was Hester Prynne's scarlet letter. I never read Hawthorne, by the by. I can't abide the New England temperament." Markham set his jaw and gave Vance a look of arctic ferocity. "You expect me to go into court, I suppose, leading your victim by the arm, and say to the judge, 'Here's the man that shot Alvin Benson. I have no evidence against him, but I want you to sentence him to death because my brilliant and sagacious friend, Mr. Philo Vance,
The inventor of stuffed perch says this man has a wicked nature." Vance gave an almost imperceptible shrug. "I shan't wither away with grief if you don't even arrest the guilty man. But I thought it no more than humane to tell you who he was, if only to stop you from chivying all these innocent people." "All right. Tell me, and let me get on about my business." I don't believe there was any longer a question in Markham's mind that Vance actually knew who had killed Benson. But it was not until considerably later in the morning that he fully understood why Vance had kept him for days upon tenterhooks. When at last he did understand it, he forgave Vance, but at the moment he was angered to the limit of his control. "There are one or two things that must be done before I can reveal the gentleman's name," Vance told him. "First, let me have a peep at those alibis." Markham took from his pocket a sheaf of typewritten pages and passed them over. Vance adjusted his monocle and read through them carefully. Then he stepped out of the room, and I heard him telephoning. When he returned, he reread the reports. One in particular he lingered over, as if weighing its possibilities. "There's a chance, you know," he murmured at length, gazing indecisively into the fireplace. He glanced at the report again. "I see here," he said, "that Colonel Ostrander, accompanied by a Bronx alderman named Moriarty, attended the midnight follies at the Piccadilly Theatre in 47th Street on the night of the 13th, arriving there a little before 12 and remaining through the performance, which was over about 2:30 a.m. Are you acquainted with this particular alderman?" Markham's eyes lifted sharply to the other's face. "I've met Mr. Moriarty. What about him?" I thought I detected a note of suppressed excitement in his voice. "Where do Bronx aldermen loll about in the forenoons?" asked Vance. "At home, I should say, or possibly at the Samoset Club. Sometimes they have business at City Hall." "My word! Such unseemly activity for a politician. Would you mind ascertaining if Mr. Moriarty is at home or at his club? If it's not too much bother, I'd like to have a brief word with him." Markham gave Vance a penetrating gaze. Then, without a word, he went to the telephone in the den. "Mr. Moriarty was at home, about to leave for City Hall," he announced on returning. "I asked him to drop by here on his way downtown." "I do hope he doesn't disappoint us," sighed Vance, "but it's worth trying." "Are you composing a charade?" asked Markham, but there was neither humour nor good nature in the question. "'Pon my word, old man, I'm not trying to confuse the main issue," said Vance. "Exert a little of that simple faith with which you are so generously supplied. It's more desirable than Norman blood, you know. I'll give you the guilty man before the morning's over. But, you see, I must make sure that you'll accept him. These alibis are, I trust, going to prove most profitable in paving the way for my coup de boutoir. An alibi, as I recently confided to you, is a tricky and dangerous thing, and open to grave suspicion. And the absence of an alibi means nothing at all. For instance, I see by these reports that Miss Hoffman has no alibi for the night of the 13th. She says she went to a motion picture theatre and then home, but no one saw her at any time. She was probably at Benson's visiting mamma until late,
Looks suspicious, eh, what? And yet, even if she was there, her only crime that night was filial affection. On the other hand, there are several alibis here which are, as one says, cast iron. A silly metaphor. Cast iron's easily broken. And I happen to know one of 'em's spurious. So be a good fellow and have patience. For it's most necessary that these alibis be minutely inspected. 15 minutes later, Mr. Moriarty arrived. He was a serious, good-looking, well-dressed youth in his late 20s, not at all my idea of an alderman, and he spoke clear and precise English, with almost no trace of the Bronx accent. Markham introduced him and briefly explained why he had been requested to call. "One of the men from the Homicide Bureau," answered Moriarty, "was asking me about the matter only yesterday." "We have the report," said Vance, "but it's a bit too general. Will you tell us exactly what you did that night after you met Colonel Ostrander?" "The Colonel had invited me to dinner and the Follies. I met him at the Marseille at 10. We had dinner there, and went to the Piccadilly a little before 12, where we remained until about 2:30. I walked to the Colonel's apartment with him, had a drink and a chat, and then took the subway home about 3:30. You told the detective yesterday you sat in a box at the theatre?" "That's correct." "Did you and the Colonel remain in the box throughout the performance?" "No. After the first act, a friend of mine came to the box, and the Colonel excused himself and went to the washroom. After the second act, the Colonel and I stepped outside into the alleyway and had a smoke." "What time would you say was the first act over?" 12:30 or thereabouts." "And where is this alleyway situated?" asked Vance. "As I recall, it runs along the side of the theatre to the street." "You're right." "And isn't there an exit door very near the boxes, which leads into the alleyway?" "There is. We used it that night." "How long was the Colonel gone after the first act?" "A few minutes. I couldn't say exactly." "Had he returned when the curtain went up on the second act?" Moriarty reflected. "I don't believe he had. I think he came back a few minutes after the second act began." 10 minutes?" "I couldn't say. Certainly no more." "Then, allowing for a 10-minute intermission, the Colonel might have been away 20 minutes?" "Yes, it's possible." This ended the interview, and when Moriarty had gone, Vance lay back in his chair and smoked thoughtfully. "Surprise and luck," he commented. "The Piccadilly Theatre, you know, is practically round the corner from Benson's house. You grasp the possibilities of the situation, what? The Colonel invites an alderman to the midnight follies, and gets box seats near an exit giving on an alley. At a little before 12:30, he leaves the box, sneaks out via the alley, goes to Benson's, taps, and is admitted, shoots his man, and hurries back to the theatre. 20 minutes would have been ample." Markham straightened up, but made no comment. "And now," continued Vance, "let's look at the indicatory circumstances and the confirmatory facts. Miss St. Clair told us the Colonel had lost heavily in a pool of Benson's manipulation, and had accused him of crookedness. He hadn't spoken to Benson for a week, so it's plain there was bad blood between 'em. He saw Miss St. Clair at the Marseille with Benson, and, knowing she always went home at midnight, he chose 12:30 as a propitious hour. although originally he may have intended to wait until much later, say 1:30 or 2, before sneaking out of the theatre. Being an army officer, he would have had a Colt .45, and he was probably a good shot. He was most anxious to have you arrest someone. He didn't seem to care who, and he even phoned you to inquire about it. He was one of the very few persons in the world whom Benson would have admitted, attired as he was. He'd known Benson intimately for 15 years, and Mrs. Platts once saw Benson take off his toupee and show it to him. Moreover, he would have known all about the domestic arrangements of the house. He no doubt had slept there many a time when showing his old pal the wonders of New York's nightlife. How does all that appeal to you?" Markham had risen and was pacing the floor, his eyes almost closed. "So that was why you were so interested in the Colonel, asking people if they knew him and inviting him to lunch. What gave you the idea, in the first place, that he was guilty?" "Guilty?" exclaimed Vance. "That priceless old dunderhead guilty? Really, Markham, the notion's preposterous. I'm sure he went to the washroom that night to comb his eyebrows and arrange his tie. Sitting, as he was, in a box, the gals on the stage could see him, you know." Markham halted abruptly. An ugly colour crept into his cheeks, and his eyes blazed. But before he could speak, Vance went on, with serene indifference to his anger. "And I played in the most astonishin' luck. Still, he's just the kind of ancient popinjay who'd go to the washroom and dandify himself. I rather counted on that, don't you know? My word, we've made amazin' progress this morning, despite your injured feelings. You now have 5 different people, any one of whom you can, with a little legal ingenuity, convict of the crime. In any event, you can get indictments against 'em." He leaned his head back meditatively. "First, there's Miss St. Clair. You were quite positive she did the deed, and you told the Major you were all ready to arrest her. My demonstration of the murderer's height could be thrown out on the grounds that it was intelligent and conclusive, and therefore had no place in a court of law. I'm sure the judge would concur. Second, I give you Captain Leacock. I actually had to use physical force to keep you from jailing the chap. You had a beautiful case against him, to say nothing of his delightful confession. And if you met with any difficulties, he'd help you out. He'd adore having you convict him. Thirdly, I submit Leander the Lovely. You had a better case against him than against almost any one of the others, a perfect wealth of circumstantial evidence. An embarras de riche, in fact. And any jury would delight in convicting him. I would myself, if only for the way he dresses. Fourthly, I point with pride to Mrs. Platts. Another perfect circumstantial case, fairly bulging with clues and inferences and legal what-nots. Fifthly, I present the Colonel. I have just rehearsed your case against him, and I could elaborate it touchingly, given a little more time." He paused and gave Markham a smile of cynical affability. "Observe, please, that each member of this quintet meets all the demands of presumptive guilt. Each one fulfills the legal requirements as to time, place, opportunity, means, motive, and conduct. The only drawback, you see, is that all 5 are quite innocent. A most discomposing fact, but there you are. Now, if all the people against whom there's the slightest suspicion are innocent, what's to be done? Annoying, isn't it?" He picked up the Alibi reports. "There's positively nothing to be done but to go on checking up these alibis." I could not imagine what goal he was trying to reach by these apparently irrelevant digressions, and Markham, too, was mystified. But neither of us doubted for a moment that there was method in his madness. "Let's see," he mused. "The Major's is the next in order. What do you say to tackling it? It shouldn't take long. He lives near here, and the entire alibi hinges on the evidence of the night boy at his apartment house. Come." He got up. "How do you know the boy's there now?" objected Markham. "I phoned a while ago and found out." "But this is damned nonsense." Vance now had Markham by the arm, playfully urging him toward the door. "Oh, undoubtedly," he agreed. "But I've often told you, old dear, you take life much too seriously." Markham, protesting vigorously, held back and endeavoured to disengage his arm from the other's grip. But Vance was determined, and after a somewhat heated dispute, Markham gave in. "I'm about through with this hocus-pocus," he growled as we got into a taxicab. "I'm through already," said Vance. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Checking an Alibi. Thursday, June 20, 10:30 a.m. The Chatham Arms, where Major Benson lived, was a small, exclusive bachelor apartment house in 46th Street, midway between 5th and 6th Avenues. The entrance, set in a simple and dignified facade, was flush with the street, and only 2 steps above the pavement. The front door opened into a narrow hallway with a small reception room, like a cul-de-sac, on the left. At the rear could be seen the elevator, and beside it, tucked under a narrow flight of iron stairs, which led round the elevator shaft, was a telephone switchboard. When we arrived, 2 youths in uniform were on duty, one lounging in the door of the elevator, the other seated at the switchboard. Vance halted Markham near the entrance. One of these boys, I was informed over the telephone, was on duty the night of the 13th. Find out which one it was, and scare him into submission by your exalted title of district attorney. Then turn him over to me." Reluctantly, Markham walked down the hallway. After a brief interrogation of the boys, he led one of them into the reception room and peremptorily explained what he wanted. Footnote 19. The boy was Jack Prisco, of 621 Kelly Street. Vance began his questioning with the confident air of one who has no doubt whatever as to another's exact knowledge. "What time did Major Benson get home the night his brother was shot?" The boy's eyes opened wide. "He came in about 11, right after show time," he answered, with only a momentary hesitation. I have set down the rest of the questions and answers in dramatic dialogue form for purposes of space economy. Vance: "He spoke to you, I suppose?" Boy: "Yes, sir. He told me he'd been to the theatre, and said what a rotten show it was, and that he had an awful headache." Vance. How do you happen to remember so well what he said a week ago? Boy. Why, his brother was murdered that night. Vance. And the murder caused so much excitement that you naturally recalled everything that happened at the time in connection with Major Benson. Boy. Sure, he was the murdered guy's brother. Vance. When he came in that night, did he say anything about the day of the month? Boy. Nothin', except that he guessed his bad luck in picking a bum show was on account of it being the 13th. Vance. Did he say anything else? Boy, grinning. He said he'd make the 13th my lucky day, and he gave me all the silver he had in his pocket, nickels and dimes and quarters and 1 50-cent piece. Vance. How much altogether? Boy. $3.45. Vance. And then he went to his room? Boy. Yes, sir. I took him up. He lives on the 3rd floor. Vance. Did he go out again later? Boy. No, sir. Vance. How do you know? Boy. I'd have seen him. I was either answering the switchboard or running the elevator all night. He couldn't have got out without my seeing him. Vance. Were you alone on duty? Boy. After 10 o'clock there's never but one boy on. Vance. And there's no other way a person could leave the house except by the front door? Boy. No, sir. Vance. When did you next see Major Benson? Boy. After thinking a moment. He rang for some cracked ice, and I took it up. Vance. What time? Boy. Why, I don't know exactly. Yes, I do. It was 12:30. Vance, smiling faintly. He asked you the time, perhaps? Boy. Yes, sir, he did. He asked me to look at his clock in his parlor. Vance. How did he happen to do that? Boy. Well, I took up the ice, and he was in bed, and he asked me to put it in his pitcher in the parlor. When I was doing it, he called to me to look at the clock on the mantel and tell him what time it was. He said his watch had stopped, and he wanted to set it. Vance. What did he say then? Boy. Nothing much. He told me not to ring his bell, no matter who called up. He said he wanted to sleep and didn't want to be woke up. Vance. Was he emphatic about it? Boy. Well, he meant it all right. Vance. Did he say anything else? Boy. No, he just said good night and turned out the light, and I came on downstairs. Vance. What light did he turn out? Boy. The one in his bedroom. Vance. Could you see into his bedroom from the parlor? Boy. No, the bedroom's off the hall. Vance. How could you tell the light was turned off, then? Boy. The bedroom door was open, and the light was shining into the hall. Vance. Did you pass the bedroom door when you went out? Boy. Sure, you have to. Vance. And was the door still open? Boy. Yes. Vance. Is that the only door to the bedroom? Boy. Yes. Vance. Where was Major Benson when you entered the apartment? Boy. In bed. Vance. How do you know? Boy. Mildly indignant. I saw him. Vance. After a pause. You're quite sure he didn't come downstairs again? Boy. I told you I'd have seen him if he had. Vance. Couldn't he have walked down at some time when you had the elevator upstairs without your seeing him? Boy. Sure he could, but I didn't take the elevator up, after I took the Major his cracked ice, until round 2:30 when Mr. Montague came in.
Vance.
You took no one up in the elevator, then, between the time you brought Major Benson the ice and when Mr. Montague came in at 2:30?
Boy.
Nobody.
Vance.
And you didn't leave the hall here between those hours?
Boy.
No, I was sitting here all the time.
Vance.
Then the last time you saw him was in bed at 12:30?
Boy.
Yes, until early in the morning, when some dame...
Footnote 20. Obviously, Mrs. Platts.
Some dame phoned him and said his brother had been murdered. He came down and went out about 10 minutes after.
Vance. Giving the boy $1.
That's all. But don't you open your mouth to anyone about our being here, or you may find yourself in the lock-up. Understand? Now get back to your job.
When the boy had left us, Vance turned a pleading gaze upon Markham.
Now, old man, for the protection of society and the higher demands of justice, and the greatest good for the greatest number, and pro bono publico, and all that sort of thing, you must once more adopt a course of conduct contrary to your innate promptings, or whatever the phrase is that you used. Vulgarly put, I want to snoop through the Major's apartment at once.
What for? Markham's tone was one of exclamatory protest. Have you completely lost your senses? There's no getting round the boy's testimony. I may be weak-minded, but I know when a witness like that is telling the truth.
Certainly he's telling the truth, agreed Vance serenely. That's just why I want to go up. Come, my Markham, there's no danger of the Major returning en surprise at this hour, and, he smiled cajolingly, you promised me every assistance, don't you know? Markham was vehement in his remonstrances, but Vance was equally vehement in his insistence, and in a few minutes later we were trespassing, by means of a pass-key, in Major Benson's apartment. The only entrance was a door leading from the public hall into a narrow passageway, which extended straight ahead into the living-room at the rear. On the right of this passageway, near the entrance, was a door opening into the bedroom. Vance walked directly back into the living-room. On the right-hand wall was a fireplace and a mantel on which sat an old-fashioned mahogany clock. Near the mantel, in the far corner, stood a small table containing a silver ice-water service, consisting of a pitcher and 6 goblets. "There is our very convenient clock," said Vance, "and there is the pitcher in which the boy put the ice. Imitation Sheffield plate." Going to the window, he glanced down into the paved rear court 25 or 30 feet below. "The Major certainly couldn't have escaped through the window," he remarked. He turned and stood a moment looking into the passageway. "The boy could easily have seen the light go out in the bedroom, if the door was open. The reflection on the glazed white wall of the passage would have been quite brilliant." Then, retracing his steps, he entered the bedroom. It contained a small canopied bed facing the door, and beside it stood a night table on which was an electric lamp. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he looked about him and turned the lamp on and off by the socket chain. Presently he fixed his eyes on Markham. "You see how the Major got out without the boy's knowing it, eh, what?" "By levitation, I suppose," submitted Markham. "It amounted to that, at any rate," replied Vance. "Deuced ingenious, too. Listen, Markham. At 12:30, the Major rang for cracked ice. The boy brought it, and when he entered he looked in through the door, which was open, and saw the Major in bed. The Major told him to put the ice in the pitcher in the living room. The boy walked on down the passage and across the living room to the table in the corner. The Major then called to him to learn the time by the clock on the mantel. The boy looked. It was 12:30. The Major replied that he was not to be disturbed again, said good night, turned off this light on his night table, jumped out of bed he was dressed, of course, and stepped quickly out into the public hall before the boy had time to empty the ice and return to the passage. The Major ran down the stairs and was in the street before the elevator descended. The boy, when he passed the bedroom door on his way out, could not have seen whether the Major was still in bed or not, even if he had looked in, for the room was in darkness. Clever, what? The thing would have been possible, of course, conceded Markham, but your specious imaginings fail to account for his return. That was the simplest part of the scheme. He'd probably waited in a doorway across the street for some other tenant to go in. The boy said a Mr. Montague returned about 2:30. Then the Major slipped in when he knew the elevator had ascended, and walked up the stairs. Markham, smiling patiently, said nothing. "You perceive," continued Vance, "the pains taken by the Major to establish the date and the hour, and to impress them on the boy's mind. Poor show! Headache! Unlucky day! Why unlucky? The 13th, to be sure. But lucky for the boy. A handful of money, all silver. Singular way of tipping, what? But a dollar bill might have been forgotten." A shadow clouded Markham's face, but his voice was as indulgently impersonal as ever. "I prefer your case against Mrs. Platt's." "Ah, but I've not finished." Vance stood up. "I have hopes of finding the weapon, don't you know?" Markham now studied him with amused incredulity. "That, of course, would be a contributory factor. You really expect to find it?" "Without the slightest difficulty," Vance pleasantly assured him. He went to the chiffonier and began opening the drawers. Our absent host didn't leave the pistol at Alvin's house, and he was far too canny to throw it away. Being a major in the late war, he'd be expected to have such a weapon. In fact, several persons may actually have known that he possessed one. And if he is innocent, as he fully expects us to assume, why shouldn't it be in its usual place? Its absence, you see, would be more incriminating than its presence. Also, there's a more interesting psychological factor involved. An innocent person who was afraid of being thought guilty would have hidden it, or thrown it away, like Captain Leacock, for example. But a guilty man, wishing to create an appearance of innocence, would have put it back exactly where it was before the shooting. He was still searching through the chiffonier. "Our only problem, then, is to discover the customary abiding place of the Major's gun. It's not here in the chiffonier," he added, closing the last drawer. He opened a kit bag standing at the foot of the bed and rifled its contents. "Nor here," he murmured indifferently. "The clothes closet is the only other likely place." Going across the room, he opened the closet door. Unhurriedly, he switched on the light. There, on the upper shelf, in plain view,
lay an army belt with a bulging holster. Vance lifted it with extreme delicacy and placed it on the bed near the window. "There you are, old chap," he cheerfully announced, bending over it closely. "Please take particular note that the entire belt and holster, with only the exception of the holster's flap, is thickly coated with dust. The flap is comparatively clean, showing it has been opened recently. Not conclusive, of course, but you're so partial to clues, Markham." He carefully removed the pistol from the holster. "Note also that the gun itself is innocent of dust. It has been recently cleaned, I surmise." His next act was to insert a corner of his handkerchief into the barrel. Then, withdrawing it, he held it up. "You see, what? Even the inside of the barrel is immaculate. And I'll wager all my Cézanne against an LL.B. degree that there isn't a cartridge missing." He extracted the magazine and poured the cartridges onto the night table, where they lay in a neat row before us. There were 7, the full number for that style of gun. "Again, Markham, I present you with one of your revered clues. Cartridges that remain in a magazine for a long time become slightly tarnished, for the catch-plate is not airtight. But a fresh box of cartridges is well sealed, and its contents retain their lustre much longer." He pointed to the first cartridge that had rolled out of the magazine. "Observe that this one cartridge, the last to be inserted into the magazine, is a bit brighter than its fellows. The inference is you're an adept at inferences, you know that it is a newer cartridge, and was placed in the magazine rather recently." He looked straight into Markham's eyes. "It was placed there to take the place of the one which Captain Haythorne is keeping." Markham lifted his head jerkily, as if shaking himself out of an encroaching spell of hypnosis. He smiled, but with an effort. "I still think your case against Mrs. Platts is your masterpiece." "My picture of the Major is merely blocked in," answered Vance. "The revealin' touches are to come. But first, a brief catechism. How did the Major know that Brother Alvin would be home at 12:30 on the night of the 13th? He heard Alvin invite Miss St. Clair to dinner. Remember Miss Hoffman's story of his eavesdropping? And he also heard her say she'd unfailingly leave at midnight. When I said yesterday, after we had left Miss St. Clair, that something she told us would help convict the guilty person, I referred to her statement that midnight was her invariable hour of departure. The Major therefore knew Alvin would be home about 12:30, and he was pretty sure that no one else would be there. In any event, he could have waited for him, what? Could he have secured an immediate audience with his brother en déshabille? Yes. He tapped on the window, his voice was recognised beyond any shadow of doubt, and he was admitted instanter. Alvin had no sartorial modesties in front of his brother, and would have thought nothing of receiving him without his teeth and toupee. Is the Major the right height? He is. I purposely stood beside him in your office the other day, and he is almost exactly 5'10½". Markham sat staring silently at the disembowelled pistol. Vance had been speaking in a voice quite different from that he had used when constructing his hypothetical cases against the others, and Markham had sensed the change. "We now come to the jewels," Vance was saying. "I once expressed the belief, you remember, that when we found the security for Fife's note, we would put our hands on the murderer. I thought then the Major had the jewels, and after Miss Hoffman told us of his requesting her not to mention the package, I was sure of it. Alvin took them home on the afternoon of the 13th, and the Major undoubtedly knew it. This fact, I imagine, influenced his decision to end Alvin's life that night. He wanted those baubles, Markham." He rose jauntily and stepped to the door. "And now it remains only to find 'em. The murderer took 'em away with him. They couldn't have left the house any other way. Therefore, they're in this apartment. If the Major had taken them to the office, some one might have seen them. And if he had placed them in a safe deposit box, the clerk at the bank might have remembered the episode. Moreover, the same psychology that applies to the gun applies to the jewels. The Major has acted throughout on the assumption of his innocence. And, as a matter of fact, the trinkets were safer here than elsewhere. There'd be time enough to dispose of them when the affair blew over. Come with me a moment, Markham. It's painful, I know, and your heart's too weak for an anaesthetic." Markham followed him down the passageway in a kind of daze. I felt a great sympathy for the man, for now there was no question that he knew Vance was serious in his demonstration of the Major's guilt. Indeed, I have always felt that Markham suspected the true purpose of Vance's request to investigate the Major's alibi, and that his opposition was due as much to his fear of the results as to his impatience with the other's irritating methods. Not that he would have balked ultimately at the truth, despite his long friendship for Major Benson. But he was struggling, as I see it now, with the inevitability of circumstances, hoping against hope that he had read Vance incorrectly, and that, by vigorously contesting each step of the way, he might alter the very shape of destiny itself. Vance led the way to the living-room, and stood for 5 minutes inspecting various pieces of furniture, while Markham remained in the doorway, watching him through narrowed lids, his hands crowded deep into his pockets. "We could, of course, have an expert searcher rake the apartment over inch by inch," observed Vance. "But I don't think it necessary. The Major's a bold, cunning soul. Witness his wide, square forehead, the dominating stare of his globular eyes, the perpendicular spine, and the indrawn abdomen. He's forthright in all his mental operations. Like Poe's Mr. D, he would recognise the futility of painstakingly secreting the jewels in some obscure corner. And anyway, he had no object in secreting them. He merely wished to hide 'em where there'd be no chance of their being seen. This naturally suggests a lock and key, what? There was no such cache in the bedroom, which is why I came here." He walked to a squat rosewood desk in the corner, and tried all its drawers, but they were unlocked. He next tested the table drawer, but that, too, was unlocked. A small Spanish cabinet by the window proved equally disappointing. "Markham, I simply must find a locked drawer," he said. He inspected the room again, and was about to return to the bedroom, when his eye fell on a Circassian walnut humidor, half hidden by a pile of magazines, on the undershelf of the centre table. He stopped abruptly, and, going quickly to the box, endeavoured to lift the top. It was locked. "Let's see," he mused. "What does the Major smoke? Romeo y Juliet perfeccionados, I believe, but they're not sufficiently valuable to keep under lock and key." He picked up a strong bronze paper knife lying on the table, and forced its point into the crevice of the humidor just above the lock. "You can't do that!" cried Markham, and there was as much pain as reprimand in his voice. Before he could reach Vance, however, there was a sharp click, and the lid flew open. Inside was a blue velvet jewel case. "Ah, dumb jewels more quick than words," said Vance, stepping back. Markham stood, staring into the humidor with an expression of tragic distress. Then, slowly, he turned and sank heavily into a chair. "Good God!" he murmured. "I don't know what to believe." "In that respect," returned Vance, "you're in the same disheartening predicament as all the philosophers. But you were ready enough, don't you know, to believe in the guilt of a half-dozen innocent people. Why should you gag at the Major, who actually is guilty?" His tone was contemptuous, but a curious, inscrutable look in his eyes belied his voice, and I remembered that, although these two men were welded in an indissoluble friendship, I had never heard a word of sentiment, or even sympathy, pass between them. Markham had leaned forward in an attitude of hopelessness, elbows on knees, his head in his hands. "But the motive," he urged. "A man doesn't shoot his brother for a handful of jewels." "Certainly not," agreed Vance. "The jewels were a mere addendum. There was a vital motive, rest assured. And I fancy, when you get your report from the expert accountant, all, or at least a goodly part, will be revealed." "So that was why you wanted his books examined?" Markham stood up resolutely. "Come, I'm going to see this thing through." Vance did not move at once. He was intently studying a small antique candlestick of Oriental design on the mantel. "I say," he muttered, "that's a devilish fine copy." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Arrest. Thursday, June 20, noon. On leaving the apartment, Markham took with him the pistol and the case of jewels. In the drugstore at the corner of Sixth Avenue, he telephoned Heath to meet him immediately at the office, and to bring Captain Hagedorn. He also telephoned Stitt, the public accountant, to report as soon as possible. "You observe, I trust," said Vance, when we were in the taxicab, headed for the Criminal Courts Building, "the great advantage of my methods over yours. When one knows at the outset who committed a crime, one isn't misled by appearances. Without that foreknowledge, one is apt to be deceived by a clever alibi, for example. I asked you to secure the alibis because, knowing the Major was guilty, I thought he'd have prepared a good one. But why ask for all of them? And why waste my time trying to disprove Colonel Ostrander's? What chance would I have had of securing the Major's alibi if I had not injected his name surreptitiously, as it were, into a list of other names? And had I asked you to check the Major's alibi first, you'd have refused. I chose the Colonel's alibi to start with because it seemed to offer a loophole, and I was lucky in the choice. I knew that if I could puncture one of the other alibis, you would be more inclined to help me test the Major's. But if, as you say, you knew from the first that the Major was guilty, why in God's name didn't you tell me and save me this week of anxiety? Don't be ingenuous, old man, returned Vance. If I had accused the Major at the beginning, you'd have had me arrested for scandalum magnatum and criminal libel. It was only by deceiving you every minute about the Major's guilt and drawing a whole school of red herrings across the trail that I was able to get you to accept the fact even today. And yet, not once did I actually lie to you. I was constantly throwing out suggestions and pointing to significant facts in the hope that you'd see the light for yourself. But you ignored all my intimations, or else misinterpreted them, with the most irritating perversity. Markham was silent a moment. I see what you mean, but why did you keep setting up these straw men and then knocking them over? You were bound, body and soul, to circumstantial evidence, Vance pointed out. It was only by letting you see that it led you nowhere that I was able to foist the Major on you. There was no evidence against him. He naturally saw to that. No one ever regarded him as a possibility. Fratricide has been held as inconceivable, a lusus naturae, since the days of Cain. Even with all my finessing, you fought every inch of the way, objecting to this and that, and doing everything imaginable to thwart my humble efforts. Admit, like a good fellow, that, had it not been for my assiduousness, the Major would never have been suspected. Markham nodded slowly. And yet there are some things I don't understand even now. Why, for instance, should he have objected so strenuously to my arresting the captain? Vance wagged his head. How deuced obvious you are! Never attempt a crime, my Markham. You'd be instantly apprehended. I say, can't you see how much more impregnable the Major's position would be if he showed no interest in your arrests? If, indeed, he appeared actually to protest against your incarceration of a victim? Could he, by any other means, have eliminated so completely all possible suspicion against himself? Moreover, he knew very well that nothing he could say would swerve you from your course. You're so noble, don't you know? But he did give me the impression, once or twice, that he thought Miss St. Clair was guilty. Ah, there you have a shrewd intelligence taking advantage of an opportunity. The Major unquestionably planned the crime so as to cast suspicion on the captain. Leacock had publicly threatened his brother in connection with Miss St. Clair, and the lady was about to dine alone with Alvin, when in the morning Alvin was found shot with an army colt. Who but the captain would be suspected? The Major knew the captain lived alone, and that he would have difficulty in establishing an alibi. Do you now see how cunning he was in recommending Fife as a source of information? He knew that if you interviewed Fife, you'd hear of the threat. And don't ignore the fact that his suggestion of Fife was an apparent afterthought. He wanted to make it appear casual, don't you know? Astute devil, what? Markham, sunk in gloom, was listening closely. Now for the opportunity of which he took advantage, continued Vance.
when you upset his calculations by telling him you knew whom Alvin dined with, and that you had almost enough evidence to ask for an indictment, the idea appealed to him. He knew no charming lady could ever be convicted of murder in this most chivalrous city, no matter what the evidence, and he had enough of the sporting instinct in him to prefer that no one should actually be punished for the crime. Consequently, he was willing to switch you back to the lady, and he played his hand cleverly, making it appear that he was most reluctant to involve her. Was that why, when you wanted me to examine his books, and to ask him to the office to discuss the confession, you told me to intimate that I had Miss St. Clair in mind? Exactly. And the person the Major was shielding was himself. But he wanted you to think it was Miss St. Clair. If you were certain he was guilty, why did you bring Colonel Ostrander into the case? In the hope that he could supply us with faggots for the Major's funeral pyre. I knew he was acquainted intimately with Alvin Benson and his entire camarilla, and I knew, too, that he was an egregious quidnunc who might have got wind of some enmity between the Benson boys, and have suspected the truth. And I also wanted to get a line on Fife, by way of eliminating every remote counter-possibility. But we already had a line on Fife. Oh, I don't mean material clues. I wanted to learn about Fife's nature, his psychology, you know, particularly his personality as a gambler. You see, it was the crime of a calculating, cold-blooded gambler, and no one but a man of that particular type could possibly have committed it. Markham apparently was not interested just now in Vance's theories. "Did you believe the Major," he asked, "when he said his brother had lied to him about the presence of the jewels in the safe?" "The wily Alvin probably never mentioned 'em to Anthony," rejoined Vance. "An ear at the door during one of Fife's visits was, I fancy, his source of information. And speaking of the Major's eavesdropping, it was that which suggested to me a possible motive for the crime. Your man Stitt, I hope, will clarify that point." "According to your theory, the crime was rather hastily conceived." Markham's statement was in reality a question. "The details of its execution were hastily conceived," corrected Vance. "The Major undoubtedly had been contemplating for some time eliminating his brother. Just how or when he was to do it, he hadn't decided. He may have thought out and rejected a dozen plans. Then on the 13th came the opportunity. All the conditions adjusted themselves to his purpose. He heard Miss St. Clair's promise to go to dinner, and he therefore knew that Alvin would probably be home alone at 12:30, and that, if he were done away with at that hour, suspicion would fall on Captain Leacock. He saw Alvin take home the jewels, another providential circumstance. The propitious moment for which he had been waiting, you see, was at hand. All that remained was to establish an alibi and work out a modus operandi. How he did this I've already elucidated." Markham sat thinking for several minutes. At last he lifted his head. "You've about convinced me of his guilt," he admitted. "But, damn it, man, I've got to prove it. And there's not much actual legal evidence." Vance gave a slight shrug. "I'm not interested in your stupid courts and your silly rules of evidence. But since I've convinced you, you can't charge me with not having met your challenge, don't you know?" "I suppose not," Markham assented gloomily.
Slowly, the muscles about his mouth tightened. "You've done your share, Vance. I'll carry on." Heath and Captain Hagedorn were waiting when we arrived at the office, and Markham greeted them in his customary reserved, matter-of-fact way. By now he had himself well in hand, and he went about the task before him with the sombre forcefulness that characterized him in the discharge of all his duties. "I think we at last have the right man, Sergeant," he said. "Sit down, and I'll go over the matter with you in a moment. There are one or two things I want to attend to first." He handed Major Benson's pistol to the firearms expert. "Look that gun over, Captain, and tell me if there's any way of identifying it as the weapon that killed Benson." Hagedorn moved ponderously to the window. Laying the pistol on the sill, he took several tools from the pockets of his voluminous coat and placed them beside the weapon. Then, adjusting a jeweler's magnifying glass to his eye, he began what seemed an interminable series of tinkerings. He opened the plates of the stock, and, drawing back the sear, took out the firing pin. He removed the slide, unscrewed the link, and extracted the recoil spring. I thought he was going to take the weapon entirely apart, but apparently he merely wanted to let light into the barrel, for presently he held the gun to the window and placed his eye at the muzzle. He peered into the barrel for nearly 5 minutes, moving it slightly back and forth to catch the reflection of the sun on different points of the interior. At last, without a word, he slowly and painstakingly went through the operation of redintegrating the weapon. Then he lumbered back to his chair and sat blinking heavily for several moments. "I'll tell you," he said, thrusting his head forward and gazing at Markham over the tops of his steel-rimmed spectacles. "This, now, may be the right gun. I wouldn't say so for sure, but when I saw the bullet the other morning, I noticed some peculiar rifling marks on it, and the rifling in this gun here looks to me as though it would match up with the marks on the bullet. I'm not certain. I'd like to look at this barrel through my helixometer." Footnote 21. A helixometer, I learned later, is an instrument that makes it possible to examine every portion of the inside of a gun's barrel through a microscope. "But you believe it's the gun?" insisted Markham. "I couldn't say, but I think so. I might be wrong." "Very good, Captain. Take it along, and call me the minute you've inspected it thoroughly." "It's the gun, all right," asserted Heath, when Hagedorn had gone. "I know that bird. He wouldn't have said as much as he did if he hadn't been sure. Whose gun is it, sir?" "I'll answer you presently." Markham was still battling against the truth, withholding even from himself his pronouncement of the Major's guilt until every loophole of doubt should be closed. "I want to hear from Stitt before I say anything. I sent him to look over Benson and Benson's books. He'll be here any moment." After a wait of a quarter of an hour, during which Markham attempted to busy himself with other matters, Stitt came in. He said a sombre good morning to the district attorney and Heath, then, catching sight of Vance, smiled appreciatively. "That was a good tip you gave me. You had the dope. If you'd kept Major Benson away longer, I could have done more. While he was there, he was watching me every minute." "I did the best I could," sighed Vance. He turned to Markham. "You know, I was wondering, all through lunch yesterday, how I could remove the Major from his office during Mr. Stitt's investigation. And when we learned of Leacock's confession, it gave me just the excuse I needed. I really didn't want the Major here. I simply wished to give Mr. Stitt a free hand." "What did you find out?" Markham asked the accountant. "Plenty," was the laconic reply. He took a sheet of paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "There's a brief report. I followed Mr. Vance's suggestion and took a look at the stock record and the cashier's collateral blotter, and traced the transfer receipts. I ignored the journal entries against the ledger and concentrated on the activities of the firm heads. Major Benson, I found, has been consistently hypothecating securities transferred to him as collateral for marginal trading, and has been speculating steadily in mercantile curb stocks. He has lost heavily. How much, I can't say." "And Alvin Benson?" asked Vance. "He was up to the same tricks, but he played in luck. He made a wad on a Columbus Motors pool a few weeks back, and he has been salting the money away in his safe, or at least that's what the secretary told me." "And if Major Benson had possession of the key to that safe," suggested Vance, "then it's lucky for him his brother was shot." "Lucky?" retorted Stitt. "It'll save him from state prison." When the accountant had gone, Markham sat like a man of stone, his eyes fixed on the wall opposite. Another straw, at which he had grasped in his instinctive denial of the Major's guilt, had been snatched from him. The telephone rang. Slowly he took up the receiver, and as he listened I saw a look of complete resignation come into his eyes. He leaned back in his chair like a man exhausted. "It was Hagedorn," he said. "That was the right gun." Then he drew himself up and turned to Heath. "The owner of that gun, Sergeant, was Major Benson." The detective whistled softly, and his eyes opened slightly with astonishment, but gradually his face assumed its habitual stolidity of expression. "Well, it don't surprise me any," he said. Markham rang for Swacker. "Get Major Benson on the wire, and tell him I'm about to make an arrest, and would appreciate his coming here immediately." His deputizing of the telephone call to Swacker was understood by all of us, I think. Markham then summarized for Heath's benefit the case against the Major. When he had finished, he rose and rearranged the chairs at the table in front of his desk. "When Major Benson comes, Sergeant," he said, "I'm going to seat him here." He indicated a chair directly facing his own. "I want you to sit at his right, and you'd better get Phelps, or one of the other men, if he isn't in, to sit at his left. But you're not to make any move until I give the signal. Then you can arrest him." When Heath had returned with Phelps, and they had taken their seats at the table, Vance said, "I'd advise you, Sergeant, to be on your guard. The minute the Major knows he's in for it, he'll go bald-headed for you." Heath smiled with heavy contempt. "This isn't the first time I've arrested Mr. Vance, with many thanks for your advice. And what's more, the Major isn't that kind. He's too nervy." "Have it your own way," replied Vance indifferently. "But I've warned you. The Major is cool-headed. He'd take big chances, and he could lose his last dollar without turning a hair. But when he is finally cornered, and sees ultimate defeat, all his repressions of a lifetime, having had no safety valve, will explode physically. When a man lives without passions or emotions or enthusiasms, there's bound to be an outlet sometime. Some men explode, and some commit suicide. The principle is the same. It's a matter of psychological reaction. The Major isn't the self-destructive type. That's why I say he'll blow up." Heath snorted. "We may be short on psychology down here," he rejoined, "but we know human nature pretty well." Vance stifled a yawn and carelessly lit a cigarette. I noticed, however, that he pushed his chair back a little from the end of the table where he and I were sitting. "Well, Chief," rasped Phelps, "I guess your troubles are about over, though I sure did think that Leacock fellow was your man. Who got the dope on this Major Benson?" "Sergeant Heath and the Homicide Bureau will receive entire credit for the work," said Markham, and added, "I'm sorry, Phelps, but the District Attorney's office, and everyone connected with it, will be kept out of it altogether." "Oh, well, it's all in a lifetime," observed Phelps philosophically. We sat in strained silence until the Major arrived. Markham smoked abstractedly. He glanced several times over the sheet of notations left by Stitt, and once he went to the water-cooler for a drink. Vance opened at random a law book before him, and perused, with an amused smile, a bribery case decision by a Western judge. Heath and Phelps, habituated to waiting, scarcely moved. When Major Benson entered, Markham greeted him with exaggerated casualness, and busied himself with some papers in a drawer to avoid shaking hands. Heath, however, was almost jovial. He drew out the Major's chair for him, and uttered a ponderous banality about the weather. Vance closed the law book and sat erect, with his feet drawn back. Major Benson was cordially dignified. He gave Markham a swift glance, but if he suspected anything, he showed no outward sign of it. "Major, I want to ask you a few questions, if you care to." Markham's voice, though low, had in it a resonant quality. "Anything at all," returned the other easily. "You own an army pistol, do you not?" "Yes, a Colt automatic," he replied, with a questioning lift of the eyebrows. "When did you last clean and refill it?" Not a muscle of the Major's face moved. "I don't exactly remember," he said. "I've cleaned it several times, but it hasn't been refilled since I returned from overseas." "Have you lent it to anyone recently?" "Not that I recall." Markham took up Stitt's report and looked at it a moment. "How did you hope to satisfy your clients if suddenly called upon for their marginal securities?" The Major's upper lip lifted contemptuously, exposing his teeth. "So that was why, under the guise of friendship, you sent a man to look over my books." I saw a red blotch of colour appear on the back of his neck and swell upward to his ears. "It happens that I didn't send him there for that purpose." The accusation had cut Markham. "But I did enter your apartment this morning." "You're a housebreaker, too, are you?" The man's face was now crimson. The veins stood out on his forehead. "And I found Mrs. Banning's jewels. How did they get there, Major?" "It's none of your damned business how they got there," he said, his voice as cold and even as ever. "Why did you tell Miss Hoffman not to mention them to me?" "That's none of your damned business either." "Is it any of my business," asked Markham quietly, "that the bullet which killed your brother was fired from your gun?" The Major looked at him steadily, his mouth a sneer. "That's the kind of double-crossing you do. Invite me here to arrest me, and then ask me questions to incriminate myself, when I'm unaware of your suspicions. A fine, dirty sport you are." Vance leaned forward. "You fool!" His voice was very low, but it cut like a whip. Can't you see he's your friend, and is asking you these questions in a last desperate hope that you are not guilty?" The Major swung round on him hotly. "Keep out of this, you damned sissy." "Oh, quite," murmured Vance. "And as for you," he pointed a quivering finger at Markham, "I'll make you sweat for this." Vituperation and profanity poured from the man. His nostrils were expanded, his eyes blazing. His wrath seemed to surpass all human bounds. He was like a person in an apoplectic fit, contorted, repulsive, insensate. Markham sat through it patiently, his head resting on his hands, his eyes closed. When at length the Major's rage became inarticulate, he looked up and nodded to Heath. It was the signal the detective had been watching for. But before Heath could make a move, the Major sprang to his feet. With the motion of rising, he swung his body swiftly about and brought his fist against Heath's face with terrific impact. The sergeant went backward in his chair and lay on the floor, dazed. Phelps leaped forward, crouching, but the Major's knee shot upward and caught him in the lower abdomen. He sank to the floor, where he rolled back and forth, groaning. The Major then turned on Markham. His eyes were glaring like a maniac's, and his lips were drawn back. His nostrils dilated with each stertorous breath. His shoulders were hunched, and his arms hung away from his body, his fingers rigidly flexed. His attitude was the embodiment of a terrific, uncontrolled malignity. "You're next." The words, guttural and venomous, were like a snarl. As he spoke, he sprang forward. Vance, who had sat quietly during the mêlée, looking on with half-closed eyes and smoking indolently, now stepped sharply round the end of the table. His arms shot forward. With one hand he caught the Major's right wrist, with the other he grasped the elbow. Then he seemed to fall back with a swift pivotal motion. The Major's pinioned arm was twisted upward behind his shoulder blades. There was a cry of pain, and the man suddenly relaxed in Vance's grip. By this time Heath had recovered. He scrambled quickly to his feet and stepped up. There was the click of handcuffs, and the Major dropped heavily into a chair, where he sat, moving his shoulders back and forth painfully. "It's nothing serious," Vance told him. "The capsular ligament is torn a little. It'll be all right in a few days." Heath came forward and, without a word, held out his hand to Vance. The action was at once an apology and a tribute. I liked Heath for it. When he and his prisoner had gone, and Phelps had been assisted into an easy-chair, Markham put his hand on Vance's arm. "Let's get away," he said. "I'm done up." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vance explains his methods. Thursday, June 20, 9 p.m. That same evening, after a Turkish bath and a dinner, Markham, grim and weary, and Vance, bland and debonair, and myself, were sitting together in the alcove of the Stuyvesant Club's lounge-room. We had smoked in silence for half an hour or more, when Vance, as if giving articulation to his thoughts, remarked, "And it's stubborn, unimaginative chaps like Heath who constitute the human barrage between the criminal and society. Sad, sad." "We have no Neapolitans to-day," Markham observed. and if we had, they'd probably not be detectives. But even should they have yearnings toward the profession, said Vance, they would be rejected on their physical measurements. As I understand it, your policemen are chosen by their height and weight. They must meet certain requirements as to heft, as though the only crimes they had to cope with were riots and gang feuds. Bulk, the great American ideal, whether in art, architecture, table d'hote meals, or detectives. An entrancing notion. At any rate, Heath has a generous nature, said Markham palliatingly. He has completely forgiven you for everything. Vance smiled. The amount of credit and emulsification he received in the afternoon papers would have mellowed anyone. He should even forgive the Major for hitting him. A clever blow, that, based on rotary leverage. Heath's constitution must be tough, or he wouldn't have recovered so quickly. And poor Phelps, he'll have a horror of knees the rest of his life. You certainly guessed the Major's reaction, said Markham. I'm almost ready to grant there's something in your psychological flummery after all. Your aesthetic deductions seemed to put you on the right track. After a pause, he turned and looked inquisitively at Vance. Tell me exactly why, at the outset, you were convinced of the Major's guilt. Vance settled back in his chair. Consider, for a moment, the characteristics, the outstanding features, of the crime. Just before the shot was fired, Benson and the murderer undoubtedly had been talking or arguing, the one seated, the other standing. Then Benson had pretended to read. He had said all he had to say. His reading was his gesture of finality, for one doesn't read when conversing with another, unless for a purpose. The murderer, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, and having come prepared to meet it heroically, took out a gun, aimed it at Benson's temple, and pulled the trigger. After that, he turned out the lights and went away. Such are the facts, indicated and actual. He took several puffs on his cigarette. Now let's analyze 'em. As I pointed out to you, the murderer didn't fire at the body, where, though the chances of hitting would have been much greater, the chances of death would have been less. He chose the more difficult and hazardous, and at the same time the more certain and efficient course. His technique, so to speak, was bold, direct, and fearless. Only a man with iron nerves and a highly developed gambler's instinct would have done it in just this forthright and audacious fashion. Therefore, all nervous, hot-headed, impulsive, and timid persons were automatically eliminated as suspects. The neat, businesslike aspect of the crime, together with the absence of any material clues that could possibly have incriminated the culprit, indicated unmistakably that it had been premeditated and planned with coolness and precision by a person of tremendous self-assurance and one used to taking risks. There was nothing subtle or in the least imaginative about the crime. Every feature of it pointed to an aggressive, blunt mind, a mind at once static, determined and intrepid, and accustomed to dealing with facts and situations in a direct, concrete, and unequivocal manner. I say, Markham, surely you're a good enough judge of human nature to read the indications, what? I think I get the drift of your reasoning, the other admitted, a little doubtfully. Very well, then, Vance continued.
Having determined the exact psychological nature of the deed, it only remained to find some interested person whose mind and temperament were such that, if he undertook a task of this kind in the given circumstances, he would inevitably do it in precisely the manner in which it was done. As it happened, I had known the Major for a long time, and so it was obvious to me, the moment I had looked over the situation that first morning, that he had done it. The crime, in every respect and feature, was a perfect psychological expression of his character and mentality. But even had I not known him personally, I would have been able, since I possessed so clear and accurate a knowledge of the murderer's personality, to pick him out from any number of suspects. "But suppose another person of the Major's type had done it?" asked Markham. "We all differ in our natures, however similar two persons may appear at times," Vance explained. "And while in the present case it is barely conceivable that another man of the Major's type and temperament might have done it, the law of probability must be taken into account. Even supposing there were two men, almost identical in personality and instincts, in New York, what would be the chance of their both having had a reason to kill Benson? However, despite the remoteness of the possibility, when Fife came into the case, and I learned he was a gambler and a hunter, I took occasion to look into his qualifications. Not knowing him personally, I appealed to Colonel Ostrander for my information, and what he told me put Fife at once hors de propos." "But he had nerve, he was a rash plunger, and he certainly had enough at stake," objected Markham. But between a rash plunger and a bold, level-headed gambler like the Major, there is a great difference, a psychological abyss. In fact, their animating impulses are opposites. The plunger is actuated by fear and hope and desire. The cool-headed gambler is actuated by expediency and belief and judgment. The one is emotional, the other mental. The Major, unlike Fife, is a born gambler, and infinitely self-confident. This kind of self-confidence, however, is not the same as recklessness, though superficially the two bear a close resemblance. It is based on an instinctive belief in one's own infallibility and safety. It's the reverse of what the Freudians call the inferiority complex, a form of egomania, a variety of folie de grandeur. The Major possessed it, but it was absent from Fife's composition, and as the crime indicated its possession by the perpetrator, I knew Fife was innocent. "I begin to grasp the thing in a nebulous sort of way," said Markham after a pause. "But there were other indications, psychological and otherwise," went on Vance. "The undress attire of the body, the toupet and teeth upstairs, the inferred familiarity of the murderer with the domestic arrangements, the fact that he had been admitted by Benson himself, and his knowledge that Benson would be at home alone at that time, all pointing to the Major as the guilty person. Another thing, the height of the murderer corresponded to the Major's height. This indication, though, was of minor importance, for had my measurements not tallied with the Major, I would have known that the bullet had been deflected, despite the opinions of all the Captain Hagedorns in the universe." "Why were you so positive a woman couldn't have done it?" "To begin with, it wasn't a woman's crime.
That is, no woman would have done it in the way it was done. The most mentalized women are emotional when it comes to a fundamental issue like taking a life. That a woman could have coldly planned such a murder, and then executed it with such business-like efficiency, aiming a single shot at her victim's temple at a distance of 5 or 6 feet, would be contrary, d'you see, to everything we know of human nature. Again, women don't stand up to argue a point before a seated antagonist. Somehow they seem to feel more secure sitting down. They talk better sitting, whereas men talk better standing. And even had a woman stood before Benson, she could not have taken out a gun and aimed it without his looking up. A man's reaching in his pocket is a natural action, but a woman has no pockets and no place to hide a gun except her handbag. And a man is always on guard when an angry woman opens a handbag in front of him. The very uncertainty of women's natures has made men suspicious of their actions when aroused. But, above all, it was Benson's bald pate and bedroom slippers that made the woman hypothesis untenable. "You remarked that a moment ago," said Markham, "that the murderer went there that night prepared to take heroic measures if necessary. And yet you say he planned the murder." "True. The two statements don't conflict, you know. The murder was planned, without doubt. But the Major was willing to give his victim a last chance to save his life. My theory is this. The Major, being in a tight financial hole, with state prison looming before him, and knowing that his brother had sufficient funds in the safe to save him, plotted the crime, and went to the house that night prepared to commit it. First, however, he told his brother of his predicament, and asked for the money. And Alvin probably told him to go to the devil. The Major may even have pleaded a bit in order to avoid killing him. But when the literary Alvin turned to reading, he saw the futility of appealing further, and proceeded with the dire business. Markham smoked a while. "Granting all you've said," he remarked at length, "I still don't see how you could know, as you asserted this morning, that the Major had planned the murder so as to throw suspicion deliberately on Captain Leacock. Just as a sculptor, who thoroughly understands the principles of form and composition, can accurately supply any missing integral part of a statue," Vance explained, "so can the psychologist who understands the human mind supply any missing factor in a given human action. I might add, parenthetically, that all this blather about missing arms of the Aphrodite of Melos and Milo Venus, you know, is the utterest fiddle-faddle. Any competent artist who knew the laws of aesthetic organization could restore the arms exactly as they were originally. Such restorations are merely a matter of context. The missing factor, you see, simply has to conform and harmonize with what is already known." He made one of his rare gestures of delicate emphasis. "Now, the problem of circumventing suspicion in every deliberate crime. And since the general conception of this particular crime was positive, conclusive, and concrete, it followed that each one of its component parts would be positive, conclusive, and concrete. Therefore, for the Major merely to have arranged things so that he himself should not be suspected would have been too negative a conception to fit consistently with the other psychological aspects of the deed. It would have been too vague, too indirect, too indefinite.
The type of literal mind which conceived this crime would logically have provided a specific and tangible object of suspicion. Consequently, when the material evidence began to pile up against the captain, and the Major waxed vehement in defending him, I knew he had been chosen as the dupe. At first, I admit, I suspected the Major of having selected Miss St. Clair as the victim, but when I learned that the presence of her gloves and hand-bag at Benson's was only an accident, and remembered that the Major had given us Fife as a source of information about the captain's threat, I realized that her projection into the role of murderer was unpremeditated. A little later Markham rose and stretched himself. "Well, Vance," he said, "your task is finished. Mine has just begun, and I need sleep." Before a week had passed, Major Anthony Benson was indicted for the murder of his brother. His trial before Judge Rudolph Hansacker, as you remember, created a nationwide sensation. The Associated Press sent columns daily to its members, and for weeks the front pages of the country's newspapers were emblazoned with spectacular reports of the proceedings. How the district attorney's office won the case, after a bitter struggle; how, because of the indirect character of the evidence, the verdict was for murder in the second degree; and how, after a retrial in the Court of Appeals, Anthony Benson finally received a sentence of from 20 years to life. All these factors are a matter of official and public record. Markham, personally, did not appear as public prosecutor. Having been a lifelong friend of the defendants, his position was an unenviable and difficult one, and no word of criticism was directed against his assignment of the case to Chief Assistant District Attorney Sullivan. Major Benson surrounded himself with an array of counsel such as is rarely seen in our criminal courts. Both Blashfield and Bower were among the attorneys for the defence. Blashfield fulfilled the duties of the English solicitor, and Bower acted as advocate. They fought with every legal device at their disposal, but the accumulation of evidence against their client overwhelmed them. After Markham had been convinced of the Major's guilt, he had made a thorough examination of the business affairs of the two brothers, and found the situation even worse than had been indicated by Stitt's first report. The firm's securities had been systematically appropriated for private speculations. But whereas Alvin Benson had succeeded in covering himself and making a large profit, the Major had been almost completely wiped out by his investments. Markham was able to show that the Major's only hope of replacing the diverted securities and saving himself from criminal prosecution lay in Alvin Benson's immediate death. It was also brought out at the trial that the Major, on the very day of the murder, had made emphatic promises which could have been kept only in the event of his gaining access to his brother's safe. Furthermore, these promises had involved specific amounts in the other's possession, and in one instance he had put up on a 48-hour note a security already pledged, a fact which in itself would have exposed his hand had his brother lived. Miss Hoffman was a helpful and intelligent witness for the prosecution. Her knowledge of conditions at the Benson and Benson offices went far toward strengthening the case against the Major. Mrs. Platts also testified to overhearing acrimonious arguments between the brothers. She stated that, after an unsuccessful attempt to borrow $50,000 from Alvin,
The Major had threatened him, saying, "If I ever have to choose between your skin and mine, it won't be mine that'll suffer." Theodore Montague, the man who, according to the story of the elevator boy at the Chatham Arms, had returned at 2:30 on the night of the murder, testified that as his taxicab turned in front of the apartment house, the headlights flashed on a man standing in a tradesman's entrance across the street, and that the man looked like Major Benson. This evidence would have had little effect had not Fife come forward, after the arrest, and admitted seeing the Major crossing 6th Avenue at 46th Street, when he had walked to Pietro's for his drink of Haig and Haig. He explained that he had attached no importance to it at the time, thinking the Major was merely returning home from some Broadway restaurant. He himself had not been seen by the Major. This testimony, in connection with Mr. Montague's, annihilated the Major's carefully planned alibi, and though the defence contended stubbornly that both witnesses had been mistaken in their identification, the jury was deeply impressed by the evidence, especially when Assistant District Attorney Sullivan, under Vance's tutoring, painstakingly explained, with diagrams, how the Major could have gone out and returned that night without being seen by the boy. It was also shown that the jewels could not have been taken from the scene of the crime except by the murderer, and Vance and I were called as witnesses to the finding of them in the Major's apartment. Vance's demonstration of the height of the murderer was shown in court, but curiously it carried little weight, as the issue was confused by a mass of elaborate scientific objections. Captain Hagdorn's identification of the pistol was the most difficult obstacle with which the defence had to contend. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and much evidence of a scandalous nature was taken. Colonel Ostrander has never forgiven Markham for not having had him called as a witness. During the last week of the trial, Miss Muriel St. Clair appeared as prima donna in a large Broadway light opera production which ran successfully for nearly 2 years. She has since married her chivalrous Captain Leacock, and they appear perfectly happy. Fife is still married and as elegant as ever. He visits New York regularly, despite the absence of his dear old Alvin, and I have occasionally seen him and Mrs. Banning together. Somehow I shall always like that woman. Fife raised the £10,000, how I have no idea, and reclaimed her jewels. Their ownership, by the way, was not divulged at the trial, for which I was very glad. On the evening of the day the verdict was brought in against the Major, Vance and Markham and I were sitting in the Stuyvesant Club. We had dined together, but no word of the events of the past few weeks had passed between us. Presently, however, I saw an ironic smile creep slowly to Vance's lips. "I say, Markham," he drawled, "what a grotesque spectacle the trial was! The real evidence, you know, wasn't even introduced. Benson was convicted entirely on suppositions, presumptions, implications, and inferences. God help the innocent Daniel, who inadvertently falls into a den of legal lions." Markham, to my surprise, nodded gravely. "Yes," he concurred, "but if Sullivan had tried to get a conviction on your so-called psychological theories, he'd have been adjudged insane." "Doubtless," sighed Vance.
You illuminati of the law would have little to do if you went about your business intelligently." "Theoretically," replied Markham at length, "your theories are clear enough. But I'm afraid I've dealt too long with material facts to forsake them for psychology and art. However," he added lightly, "if my legal evidence should fail me in the future, may I call on you for assistance?" "I'm always at your service, old chap, don't you know," Vance rejoined. "I rather fancy, though, that it's when your legal evidence is leading you irresistibly to your victim that you'll need me most. What?" And the remark, though intended merely as a good-natured sally, proved strangely prophetic.
End of chapter 25, and end of The Benson Murder Case, a Philo Vance story by S.S. Van Dyne. Recording by Kirsten Wever, with many thanks to Trisha G. of LibriVox for, among other things, many dozens of hours of meticulous proofing.